Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's hard to find a book that is insightful and elegant, all at the same time, and that takes a concept that you thought you knew what it was, or you'd never really bothered to look at closely, and then it makes it very clear to you very quickly that, wow, this really matters, and I'm glad I picked up this book. And Tom has certainly succeeded at that in Phenomenology of the Will. You can find it on Amazon. I highly suggest it. It's frankly beautifully written. It's very, I found, easy to follow, but not in the sense of there's a difference between writing in a manner that is easy to follow and simplistic. Those are not the same thing. This is not a simplistic book. If it's simple, it is in that classic philosophical way where you take something simple and everything unfolds from it, which is one of the highest compliments. And I found myself taking quite a few notes on it, thinking about it, revisiting it. And he makes the case toward the beginning here, and I loved how he worded this on this idea, is it would not be surprising if such a maladapted conception of will were at least partly responsible for our inability to adequately address the manifold crises that are described in the book and that many people on the liminal web are talking about all the time. And he makes a strong case where if some of our core principles are not with the times or they haven't been rethought to be adequate for the age, then there are real consequences to that. We don't often think that ideas are practical, but all practice is through a lens of ideas. And if we don't have the right ideas about ideas or things that make up the human experience, the consequences can be, well, dire, but then we also kind of lack the eyes to see them because we don't have the concept. And so it becomes quite an issue. But Tom has given us a wonderful book. Well, Tom, thank you for being here. The book is from Parallax Publishing. And if I were to ask you why you wrote the book, what you hope to accomplish with it, what would you respond to that, sir? And thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me and for all your encouragement. It's always nice to talk with you. So now it's like, I mean, you already mentioned, one of the starting points of the book is like with every epoch and every, episteme or worldview, our terms and concepts kind of develop and change. And you see that, with truth or religion or love. And so it's like what love meant through the different epochs that we already had. It's not always the same thing. So it changes, but we are changing and, our challenges are changing. And now when we look into something like a concept or an idea of will and look what it means, right? So it comes from a time when modernity was unfolding, when secularism and humanism wasn't, unfolding. And so there's an idea of a subject-object difference embedded and inbuilt in the concept of will that was Fichte was talking about and Hegel and Schopenhauer, something that is opposed to the world as something we can do in the world. We can change something in the world through the agency of our will, basically, right? And so this is all fine and dandy, till there's some development in society and we kind of grew out of these conceptions. And so we already know this from systems theory, from cognitive science, that this is like a distinction that is kind of arbitrary and has a developmental history, but also a developmental future. But now when you're facing new crises or a meaning crisis or meta crisis, but you work with old concepts where the system, the subject-object dualism is still embedded, then you're transporting this basic guiding difference into the confrontation with the problem, and that kind of frames how you interact and act with the world. And so the idea was, okay, so can we redefine and look will and again, and can we look at what we can do with this in terms of the recent developments that we had in our culture, and again, system science, complexity science, and all of this. And so that was the basic idea to look in this, this old, this human capacity and you find a way to maybe reshape our understanding of it.
I think that's brilliant. What you were saying there on an old concept, one of my favorite thinkers, Alfred Korbosky, he wrote a book called Science and Sanity. And a point that he makes in that book is he talks about the limits, our horizons are very much set by the symbolics we use. So he makes the point where he said, if we were still using Roman numerals, it would
Right,
literally be impossible to do modern physics. That the
right,
symbolic you use directly impacts the constraints or enabling constraints or restricting constraints, as you talk about, for our ability to think. And there was a gentleman at Voicecraft who was talking about grammatics and this idea that we have to think the grammar according to which we think. Words are not simply symbols, words, etc., so forth, are not simply representation. They set the frame in which one can think
Exactly.
and what can be thought. And so, and Alfred Korbowski was fascinating because he, in his book, he's basically warning that in our language, there's too much identification, saying what a thing is and isness. And he's like,
Right.
in isness, and that he's actually basically saying that that's going to cause mental illness or cause madness because we don't live in a world of isness. That doesn't mean, and he talks about the mind virus of identification. And really, what
Right.
he wants to move toward is basically relations. I like to talk about situation inspired by Leibniz. There's a way in which things are not things, they're more so situations that are then broken down into things to make them intelligible. But actually, that act of breaking down runs the risk of over identifying the situation with the thing. And you do this without even realizing it because it becomes your habit. Your kind of sociologist will talk about habitus. It becomes the thing you get used to. And you get so used to thinking according to identification and thinghood at the expense of situation that you don't even realize you're doing it. And then you get kind of trapped in a conception of the world. Like you make the point where will, even today, will is defined as the intensity and duration of investment in a final state or goal. I think that's getting at what people think. And if I were to ask you, if you incorporate systems thinking, if you incorporate kind of modern development in physics and sociology and stuff like that, and you talk about Luhmann a lot, and I really appreciate that. I think it's his time. He needs to be thought. And but what are some ways that will changes as a concept or a construct if you incorporate, say, systems thinking, going with your book and your own thinking?
Okay, so there are different ways to start about this, and I think one way, and you alluded to this, and so there is a problem as soon as we take that what we observe as given, right? And if we confuse our concepts and our ideas as something that is inherent to the world, the world is like this and this, and so we when we kind of this close of the idea that we can only observe for what we have the language and the concepts for,
Yeah.
basically. And so the idea basically is not to look at specific phenomena, cultural phenomena. I mean that could have been a way to write the book, basically. Like Sloterdijk writes a book.
Yeah.
He writes about social phenomena and like in the book Spheres, and then he creates a philosophy out of that. The problem is that it's always his view on things, his bias, his ideas, his metaphysics. And so, like, how do you account for the problem that with different authors you have different metaphysics and biases and ideas and paradigms and narratives and what so on? And so I was looking at observation itself. And so because of you mentioned, systems theory. So instead of, what are we looking at? Like, I started off the book with asking, what does looking at mean? What does observation mean? Right? And can we integrate that into a modeling of the will itself? Because whatever will is, observation is embedded within.
Mm.
Right. So because if to do something, to want something, you have to at least certain degree to know what you want. So there's a moment of cognition in there in will, and to a lesser extent sometimes to a greater extent. Right. And so observation is embedded into volition in any way. And so instead of creating just another model of the will, I'm started the book by looking at what is observation itself, and created a framework by which it, at least I think, allowed me to frame will differently. So just to start off there.
I think it's a great answer. What you're saying on, this question of experience, choice, observation. And Sloterdijk makes me think a bit about, there was a man named kind of Owen Barfield, and he made the argument that language, poetry are kind of artifacts of consciousness, that you can see how consciousness in the mind changes based on the kind of stories people tell, the way they use language, and so on and so forth. And that you really do see a certain transformation, at least in how people observe, maybe the things they emphasize, and so on, if you just follow the literature. It kind of like literature turns into almost artifacts, right? And there's people like Hans Gadamer in Truth and Method that says if you want to learn history, it's actually really good to look at paintings, because paintings don't just give you the information of history, it gives you the horizon of seeing
Right.
of history.
Right.
And
Of
so
course.
there's something about if you don't, so the point is, if you don't take observation into account, like you're doing in your work, you're going to actually be missing something very, very important. You're going to be skipping a step. That's going to lead you straight to what does the poem mean? Which again has a role, but you're skipping the question of, well, what was the horizon that is suggested by the literature being X way versus Y way, that then frames the very concerns of meaning, right? Because questions of meaning are going to be within frames of observation, if you will, or ways of understanding and seeing. And I think also for me, in a beautiful way, and I'll give it back to you if you have any thoughts on any of that, is at the end of your book, you'll talk about how rationality can't help but try to be aesthetic, right? It's trying to get a kind of structure, crystalline, it's trying to get coherence. There's always kind of an effort for coherence. In a similar way, I think the artist, when they try to make a work, it's hard as an artist to not seek coherence, even if you're going for some sort of absurdism or something. Well, then there's a kind of coherence of which is required for you to accomplish that goal, right? So that it
Right.
can be intelligible as absurdism. So it's interesting because I also think observation has a way of searching for something that's coherent to it. And that's what stands out
Right.
to it, right? And so there's something about the entire human being that, and I'd be curious what you think, we can't help but be toward something aesthetic in it, quote unquote, something that has this kind of aesthetic feature in our experience. And then to me, what's so interesting, as I think your work and what you're saying points to a very powerful defense of art, because the artist is creating experiences that we can observe to then open the scope of what we could want and what we could find meaningful that wouldn't exist if the artist didn't create those experiences, right? If they
Right.
didn't create these things we observe. So I think also just placing observation as central to me also helps just kind of make a case for why creativity or the creation of new things is really, really important. And I guess what I was saying with Slaughter in his Spears trilogy, there's this notion of, if we look at the history of the bubble, if we of the spear and how it works through history, that actually says something about our sociological moment and our horizon and
Right.
our way of thinking. And I always love that section where he talks about Atlas with the beard. That blew my mind. I never realized that. It's like, oh my gosh, Atlas does have a beard. And that means he's a
Right.
philosophical being. Frick. But the idea is, I'm a big fan of the use of art to say something about observation, but then the reason why you can even do that is because there is this primacy of observation that is leading to the creation and it is built on by the creation. I'll throw it at you at any thoughts at anything.
Yeah, well, I mean, the will to coherence as an inherent aspect of art is important, is inbuilt. But I mean, the interesting thing is there's a flip side to this, and this is called narcissism, because every author is in love with his own creation, and so it's like, and the issue that I have and always had, and I'm not making this up, you have more than 500 theories about consciousness, right? They can't be all true. Maybe the bulk of it's true, and some are maybe more true than other, but there are also some that are not true, right? But every author is in love, and every psyche is in love with its own creation. And so how do you account for this? It's like we're creating things and we believe them to be true. And I don't want to fall into the trap to just create another theory of will. And so how do you account for this? How do you account for the multitude of ideas, like the multitude of worldviews, of epistemes? It's like there's an inbuilt joke. There's a joke that every publisher in Germany knows, right? Not again a book about consciousness. It's really true, and it's like I'm a publisher in Germany, because it's like. Because it's at certain point it's very arbitrary. That doesn't mean there could be like a scientific method applied to it, but just the idea that again, not all theories can be true. And so, like, how do we deal with this? How do we account for the fact that we're in love with our theories and models? And so, okay, so let's not look at the theories itself. Let's look at how we create them. That was the idea. Let's look at observation, right? And how do we observe anything? And by that way, we can integrate our need to build models. And I call this in this book observation second order, where we deal with symbols and model making and all this kind of stuff. But we do it in a conscious way because that's obviously something that we can do. And so we also, and I just want to say, we have this impulse for coherence and creating like an integral theory or like an all-encompassing philosophy and have a drive to coherence, but we at the same time have to account for the narcissism that we fall in love with our own theories, and we have to find a bulwark against it, to be critical, to have the ability to critically think about our own models, basically, not only in theory and in philosophy, but basically in regard of our social life, of our inner life. And as soon as you do that, you come to a stage where you can begin to frame will and cognition differently. That
I
was the whole point.
I strongly agree. You have that wonderful part where, taking that all to account, the only thing left for us to do is turn to the act of observation itself and to integrate what is observed only in passing. I think that's extremely important because what I hear you saying is like, if you just are focused on what you're observing, well, then you get an infinite proliferation problem, right?
Right.
And so you have to focus on what causes or leads to the proliferation, because once you get into the proliferation, there's a question of how much progress can be made, right? Because there can always be a counter to whatever is created, et cetera, so forth. And a lot of the work that I do, because what I was reading, I was associating observation with this. I'll talk about rationality. The true isn't the rational. And what I mean by that is rationality is, I'll talk about map making, which is basically coherent. You're creating coherences, right?
Right.
Rationality is in the business of coherence, doesn't really care that much about correspondence. And of course, that means you get rationality plus ego. You've got a major problem because it's just going to be an infinite map proliferation per se. And I'm
Right.
obviously playing on, Korbowski is the one who comes up with the phrase or is attributed the phrase, the map is not the territory. And so
Right.
that idea and what he's kind of warning about is very similar to what you're saying, is that a world focused on isness, identification, is simply going to make infinite theories of consciousness, theories of fill in the blank, right? And it will just be infinite coherent systems that will cause fragmentation, pulling apart. And that will either lead for him, and I think this has been seen, into radical isolationism, the inability for people to socially interact with one another. It will also
Right.
lead to a moralization of your way of seeing the world as the way of seeing the world, and anyone who
Right.
disagrees becomes
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah,
bad guy.
exactly.
And so
Yeah.
what he in trying to, it reminds me of what you're saying there, in saying that identification is not possible only as a failed model. Basically, George Box is, he's like, all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So,
Right.
it's that idea too. It's like, yeah, identification is useful, but precisely because it's useful, it's dangerous. Because it is useful, it is easy to overfit it, I believe, is the computer science. But I sometimes question if I'm using that or is it supposed to be underfitting. But anyway, the very use of it is what tempts us to make it the thing, right? But you see, if you create an internally consistent system, a map, something that's entirely coherent, well, the ego thinks it works great. Of course it works, because it does the
Of
thing
course.
of making the ego feel great, and then it sees the world according to that. And so it's so critical to bring in some reminder of the question of correspondence, which for me is the question of truth. And I associate truth also with non-rationality, not irrationality. And basically what ends up happening is that all rationality without a non-rational element eventually ends up in Nash equilibria. It ends up in game theory problems. It ends up, well, the term I like is autocannibalism. It will eat itself eventually in its coherence, in its crystalline structure, right? So there has to be something of correspondence. And, well, that's where You need to locate your thought in where the ego is, say, shattered, or where the ego encounters limit, or where it comes up against something, or where it hits otherness. A lot of the psychoanalysis people want to structure on the failure of a relationship or the moment of misunderstanding. My favorite, what I started, I fell in love with Harold Bloom's emphasis on irony, because he said all great literature is ironic, right? Well, but the key to irony, and then I'll give it back to you with a question. Um, Irony is not simply where something bad occurs. It's where X does Y to get Z, and Y is precisely why X doesn't get Z. The very thing that they did for Z is precisely what then keeps Z from them. That's irony, deeper than merely misfortune. But what irony unveils is that the mind is a frenemy. The mind constructs the world towards you in a way
Right.
that you think, if I do this, it will turn out. But actually, great literature shows you that that you've got a problem. The very thing by which you understand the world is almost in the business of getting you in trouble or making you fall into narcissism and different things. So there has to be mechanisms. So for me, irony was a kind of revelation that philosophy kind of had to start in irony, or for David Hume, has to start in common life, the encounter with the actual and the real, or with Peter Berger or Philip Reef and different sociology. It has to occur in the very fact that if you give humans full choice, they go nuts, right? Because they don't have any standard by which to make choice. They're overwhelmed by anxiety. But then if there's something that helps them make choice, they could be a victim of totalitarianism. Oh boy, how do we deal with that, right? Which creates all of these different tensions. And so if we don't start with something non-rational, which is another way to word that, is that the non-rational is what gives rise to the things you can ask rational questions about. So observation gives rise to all of the theories of consciousness. If you don't start with that, you're always going to be in a spurious infinity, to use that Hegelian term. You're always going to be in a infinite proliferation that will seem like intellectual development, but actually it's all quite flat. It's all actually the
Right.
same thing, just from different emphases, different language games, different kind of structures. So I'm a huge fan of what you're doing to base it on the initial act that leads to the proliferation and the crystalline structures. Because otherwise, inevitably, ego gets in, and ultimately, you don't make nearly as much progress as you could. And so, if I were to ask you, what I do see as one of the moves you make in your book that I think is aligning with this is, instead of thinking about, and correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, I understand one of the main things you want to do is not so much think about will as, say, removing barrier, removing otherness, getting out of the ways that are restricting you, but actually looking at ways to work with, identify with, kind of see the limitations or the otherness as something that will actually finds itself in working through, as opposed to just getting lost in infinite proliferation. So maybe a way I would, word that is, Hegel at the beginning of the Philosophy Right kind of makes that idea that we can kind of talk about, there's Isaiah Berlin's freedom from, there's freedom to, negative freedom, positive freedom, but there's almost a third freedom. And forgive me if I'm overly conflating will and freedom. I don't mean to do that. But there's also freedom in, where you actually find freedom in where you set, or you find freedom in your choice, or you find freedom in your limitations. You find freedom in the way that you carry yourself. And that limit then, and there might be other ways to put this, is actually a non-rational revelation, an encounter that keeps you from infinite proliferations of different coherences and things that you think will make you happy, or theories of consciousness, or new artistic creations that just ultimately become spurious. I'd be curious any thoughts you have on any of that at all, Tom.
I think, what's interesting, hearing what you say, is a lot of these authors that you mentioned, philosophers, they have like a systems theoretic background. It's like we're all living in this kind of paradigm, because people noticed, that naive realism and naive materialism doesn't work so much, and that we can't just look at the thing itself, but how do we come to this thing in itself? And what I was trying to do in terms of will, and so basically, only a tiny fraction of what is in this book is like comes from me, because I was looking what the systems people were doing. I was looking what Hegel was doing. You know, the whole idea of different observers comes from systems theory.
Yeah.
They have like two different observers. I differentiated a little bit more. Schopenhauer had this whole idea about will, and Hegel had a different idea of will, three stages of will. And so I was like thinking, how can I bring all this kind of together? Because we also have to account for the fact that Hegel was kind of a patriarch and an inventor of modernity. So how can we bring him and his ideas into our world now, and he says that very explicitly, that the will is facing the world. That is a very modern notion of will, you know, a will facing the world. And so like, but you already distinguish between three forms of will, you know, like a kind of pre-egoic will, a will that has more or less no option, just one way of being. Then a will that has like two options and can choose, and then a will that is kind of reflective. So how can we integrate these kinds of this differentiation with the postmodern, basically the postmodern insight that we have to look at observation itself, right? That we have to get rid of the myth of the given and all these kind of guiding differentiations that we use to orient ourselves in the world with. And so basically I was putting all this in a pot and stirring it like a great goulash, and, and seeing what comes out of it. But it's true. It's like, and then you come, and because you said so much, I try to find a framing here. So what I try to do is not to see will as an agency, because that points back as to the individual that is facing the world. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense. So what happens if you kind of transcend, and I mean this not particularly in the spiritual sense, but I think you could use it if you want to, but I don't mean it necessarily that way. So if you transcend this kind of guiding difference between subject and object and look at will as a world state that can encompass, you know, subject and world if you want to, or the individual if you're going with Deleuze and Baudrillard and all these people, but you look at it as a state that we can participate in. And then you don't have to ask what is will, but rather when is will. Like what are the aspects of, you know, the state appearing? Because like if you want like a cultural analysis, we already are there. It's like concepts like flow from this psychologist Csikszentmihalyi. You know, this is like a perfect description of a concept of will that goes beyond a dualistic form, because he defines, you know, flow as a state of a heightened state of unity and attention of, you know, between world and self, where you are optimally aligned to achieve a certain goal, let's say, right? And so you already have a kind of trans-rational conception of will, but it's not formally structured, so it's just a psychological idea. And so you have like different kinds of culture already came up with different forms of will. Right. And so like maybe just as a last example, to just put on some meat, an example I always like to bring on is, have you seen the movie Full Metal Jacket?
Yes.
Okay, so you have the two main protagonists basically are Joker and you have Animal Mother. And Joker has, of course, the problem that he is a moral person. He has never killed somebody. And at the end of the movie, he chooses to kill the sniper, although she's a woman, but because she's suffering. And so it's his first kill. And he suffers, and he's changed after this. So he enacts something that I call in the book some form of egoic kind of rational kind of will, because he has options. Right? He doesn't have to do it, but he has a moral impetus to do that, and he does it. And contrasting Joker is, of course, Animal Mother. When Animal Mother is charging the field where the sniper is to rescue his comrade, he doesn't have a choice. That's why he's called Animal Mother, because he acts out of an instinct. Right, but it's still his will, but he doesn't have a choice, and so that is like the pre-egoic form of will. You know, it's like he's not really the author. He doesn't have an alternative, right? And so that was the way of thinking about it.
I think that's a wonderful example. My wife and I, we were just having a conversation on nesting. And she was talking about how nesting is so interesting because you just find yourself cleaning things. It's not like you even, like if you
Right,
wanted to choose to clean, it was really hard. But there's something interesting in nesting where something kind of overcomes you that you are
right,
participating in. And then if I were to ask you, well, do you want to clean everything? The word want is kind of not high enough of a dimensionality. It's getting at it, but it's also lacking some sort. It's not just the ego. It's hard to use the
right.
word want because we think of it as the ego. And what's so interesting too is there something about nesting, and we were talking about it because I would associate nesting with flow state, with those moments of great artistic dance where you forget yourself. I think a lot about Timothy Keller has an idea of self-forgetfulness, which we can associate with the flow. And there's this question of should you be selfish, should you be selfless, or should you self-forget? And you see what ends up happening is if you're selfish, well, we all know that's not good, right? But he also points out you can be selfish simply by thinking in terms of yourself all the time, not just in terms of dominance, but if you're always asking yourself questions, do I want to, is it good, what do I think? You're in kind of that realm of making the self center. Well, then you say, well, let's be selfless. Well, the problem with that is if you go too far, it could be self-degradatory, right? Where you're just making a point to say how bad of an artist you are or how bad at stuff you are, et cetera, so forth, right? Where really the highest form is self-forgetfulness, where there is almost, to use Mr. Ebert's language, there can be such an excess and saturation of, say, a capacity or an ability that you just find yourself doing and flowing with and able to go and not thinking about yourself. It's not in the calculation structure. It becomes more like flow. It's a state of kind of self-forgetful. And what's so interesting is, in my opinion, it seems as if people find their fullness. You could even say their highest meaning, although the word meaning means many things, in states of things like nesting, flow. But you see what's critical that I think you're pointing at, and I'd be curious and I'd also be curious to hear any thoughts on autopoiesis. I struggle with this word, autopoiesis, that comes up in the book a lot. I think this is very important. The thing that I think you're pointing at that I think is extremely important is there's some kind of conditionalism, is the word I like to use. There are certain conditions that have to be met for us to find ourselves in the self-forgetful mode. You can't just will it, but it's also mistaken to say that you can't will to bring about the conditions of its possibility that arises or is more likely to arise or then go away, right? Like you can do things that then in terms of even the ego, just choosing, well, I'm going to say will to, like, for example, I think about writing. I choose to put on basically the same outfit every day. I choose to have a certain routine that I follow for the sake of actually forgetting myself. Because when I know what I'm going to wear the next morning, when I know what time I'm going to eat, then there's a way that actually I'm trying to make choices to get out of the ego. I'm using my ego to make choices to get it out of the way, right? To create a certain condition the next morning where I'm actually then just kind of going. I'm in a kind of flow. And actually that feels more like freedom because the funny thing is if you're stuck in calculation, you actually don't feel free. If you constantly are having to make egoic choices, it can feel like, overwhelmed, anxious. What do I do now, right? So there's a funny way in which you seem like you're free because you're making choices, but actually it doesn't really feel that much like freedom because you're stuck in the ego, right? But to me, what you're describing that I think systems and like you're saying, multiple observers bring out is we need to think more, I want to say almost architecturally, environmentally, structurally, because it's not merely modernity asks subject-object divide, just like you brought up, right? Is it subjective or is it objective? And if it's subjective, it's not real. But if it's objective, it's an object, so it's dead or something. When really I think about, well, I said it, conditionalism, which is, I'll use an Owen Barfield example. Is a rainbow subjective? Is it a hallucination? No, but there are certain conditions that have to be there to experience a rainbow. There has to be raindrops, there has to be light, but anyone under those conditions could experience the rainbow, right? So it's not merely subjective, but it's also not objective in the same way of kind of a constant brick or something. There are conditions that have to be met. I think about a shadow, thinking of, in praise of shadows or some, on the idea, a shadow is not merely light or darkness. A shadow is an object in a certain position with the light that then produces the effect of a shadow. Or a veil. A veil is not merely open, but it's also not a wall, right? There are certain conditions that can be created to create certain phenomenon that are not reducible to a simple binary, right? They exist in this kind of, this conditional space that makes possible an experience that otherwise could not be possible. And I think a lot of what, and please correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of, I think what we need to do is thinking about the will is trying to move it into something more like that than just locating it in the ego. Because if we just keep it in
Right.
the ego, then we're
Yes.
not, we're actually just stuck in ego, calculation, want, and subject versus object, as opposed to more of working with what is the case to make the givens actually into conditions that will actually bring about perhaps the, dare I say, self-creation or the kind of work that we want to have in networks with other peoples and ourselves. I'd be curious any thoughts you have on any of that. And again, I also am very curious on the concept of autopoiesis in your work, because that seems very important. And so I'll give it back to you.
The interesting thing is, that systems theory and all these kind of things allows me to harmonize Schopenhauer's and Hegel's conception of will, and they do seem kind of contrary to each other, but there
Sure.
is a way to do this, and I think a way to do this is, for example, by way of resonance,
Mm,
right? So when we're speaking about animal mother and this pre-egoic, and you say it's not an egoic thing, so he needs to protect his comrades, or when you're talking about a nesting impulse, for example, then you are basically that's a pre-egoic. That doesn't mean it's bad.
right.
It's just like the ego is not really concerned about itself. It's like I have to care now.
Yes.
But the background of this is, of course, it's a biological impetus,
Mm,
right? And so you're like in very much in resonance with what biology learned about, by the last 8 billion years. It's like you need a nesting, and so you need protection, you need to care, and so that takes hold of us, as soon as we're in a certain state, or if one is pregnant to a certain degree, these hormones kick in, and you partake in the story of the human genome and the reproduction, the autopoietic reproduction of the human race. Basically, it's like autopoiesis means to create a process whose end result is the sustainability of that very process.
yeah.
And so it's like the egoistic gene by Dawkins. So this whole idea of circular reproduction. And so that's a universal law, because you can look at it in biology. Luhmann did it in terms of sociology. Then there are like physicists who used autopoiesis to explain how galaxies and star systems move and develop. So it's a kind of universal law. And then what Luhmann did, and because Luhmann is a sociologist, what Luhmann did was in a very short article, like in 1984, in a German magazine, he applied the idea of autopoiesis onto psyche and consciousness. Right, and so and nobody knows in the English speaking world, nobody knows it has never been translated, but he was basically the first one to use this concept onto and use it for consciousness. And his basic idea was that there is an autopoietic principle going on in our minds. So, and he described it very simply. He says, you have a thought right now. And then you think about that thought.
Mm,
But what happens when you think about that thought? You take that thought and make an image out of this, right? And so because you use it as you observation again, you take that thought, you distance yourself from it, you make a unit out of it as an image suddenly. And then you can make the second step in this dialectical progress. You can take different different kind of units and create a thought out of it.
Yeah.
And so there's a dialectic, an autopoietic dialectic going on. And so it was a very short article, but basically I was thinking, okay, so let's expound on this idea. So what does it mean for observation? What does it mean for will? Because somebody like Animal Mother is not concerned about the mechanics of the mind, let's say. It doesn't concern him. Right? He's like, he doesn't need to know what consciousness is or what worldviews are or like what philosophies, he just cares.
Yeah.
Right? But also we are subjected to evolution. And so by 1970, by 1980, we became aware of, autopoiesis and, and in the last 150 years about consciousness and psychology. And now we have to deal with the fact. And now we have to account for the fact that there is an autopoietic mechanism in our mind. How does that change our conception of will? It has to be integrated. But if you do this, you're becoming aware that the difference, the guiding difference between subject and object is kind of arbitrary. It's something that the mind came up. So what happens if you take that guiding difference and put some brackets, onto it so that you can view it critically and apply to it? Then you come to some forms of will that are kind of, trans-rational, trans-egoic, because they don't necessarily use that subject-object difference, right. And they more than anything else that they can incorporate the autopoiesis of psyche itself. And it does sound a little bit technical, but I mean, somebody has to write it technically because,
I think it's brilliant. I mean, one is almost tempted to think that the invention of the subject-object divide is an ego benefiting itself so that it can
right.
infinitely create coherence at its own leisure and pleasure. Because again, if there's a subject-object divide, well, hey, you can't blame us for just coming up with another theory of consciousness. What else can we do, right? So it becomes almost a means of rationalizing the map proliferation or the theory proliferation or the coherence proliferation, right? But if you start saying there's no subject-object divide, so my theory has to somehow come in contact with that of which is the object that could break it. It has to come in, it has to eventually reconnect with the object. One is tempted here to think of a call, Popper's falsification, obviously, is there something falsifiable, the difference between science and pseudoscience, et cetera, so forth. And regardless what one thinks of, if that notion is too simplistic, there is a wisdom in the idea that if you don't have some sort of ultimate test, some sort of ultimate encounter, I like to talk about encounterology, you're very much you're probably going to end up in infinite coherence creation, which is spurious coherence, one almost wants to say. That's also why, just as a moment, David Hume, my beloved David Hume, it's very important to understand that when he, for example, says you can never get from is to ought, what he's trying to say is you can only get to ought from suchness. And what I mean by that is he was very concerned about people coming up with definitions of what a thing is from a distance outside of experience and then determining what ought to be done based on that definition. So when he's emphasizing you can't get from is to ought, what he's saying is you can only determine what a thing ought to do from living with it and experiencing it. So as a quick example, if you say all cats, ought to be left outside, for example, right? Well, that may apply to 98% of cats, but what about that particular cat down the street that's missing a leg, right? Oh, well, that cat ought to maybe be given different conditions. Maybe it should be kept in a barn because otherwise it will get killed, right? So the point that David Hume is very, very concerned about basically splits between subject and object that are going to be an invitation for power. Because then a king far away can say, well, I know what people are, therefore I know what they ought to do, and it becomes an invitation of tyranny. And without getting into it, in my opinion, David Hume was perhaps too subtle. He made a very key distinction between good philosophy and bad philosophy at the beginning of his treatise. Then he gave a bunch of case studies of it and then re-brought it up at the end. But by then you're lost in the case studies, and he's trying to make an overarching claim that basically what you're saying, good philosophy never loses sight of the observation, of the encounter, of this sort of route further rationality, or otherwise you end up in bad philosophy, which for him is just infinite proliferation of coherent metaphysic systems or whatever, that then for him is not inconsequential, because when that infinite proliferation occurs, power comes in, a tyrant comes in and sweeps you off your feet. And you could almost say today that's maybe the algorithm or something, right? If we want to make a parallel, right? So I love David Hume. And I think also, you also mentioned the pre-egoic. For me, another test is a theory that needs people to believe in it to be true is problematic. A good theory is one that even if people have never heard of observation or never thought actually applies, right? But that's
Right.
automatically humbling, because a theory, like if you say, well, theorists, you're going to create things that aren't going to really change people's behavior, but really almost just be a map for us to have a better understanding what's already occurring so we can get better at conditioning at that which is ultimately transrational. I don't like that. Let me give me that ego theory that's going to give me some control, right?
Right.
Because what you're talking about autopoiesis, and I'd be curious how you would respond to this. I guess when I'm talking about the conditionalism, how I took it in your book, Thinking Barfield, is that perhaps we could say a role of the ego or the individual is to create the conditions for the autopoiesis, right? Like, and there are certain conditions in which autopoiesis can occur, and there are certain conditions of which perhaps it's less optimal, or we make it inefficient because we are still stuck in ego. So maybe we end up in a game theory problem that leads to another Cuban Missile Crisis or something like that, right? Which would seem to be not advantageous for the continuation of biology, for example, right? But if you actually kind of are thinking, no, we actually have to figure out how to maintain the conditions so the process can continue as a process. That's a very different set of priorities, because I guess also I've been reading that book right there, Waiting for Gambling with Armageddon. I'm obsessed with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think it's like I think it's an insanely important historic episode. And to me, that's a lot of the threat right now, is some unexpected event where stuff gets out of control because people are at the mercy of basically their ego or rationality, and they end up in a situation that's going to get us all killed. Cool. That's great. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, I guess, is what I have in mind. And he also wrote the really good book on Oppenheimer, American Prometheus, that became the movie. But the idea is, if we think about the will, because it's interesting too, because if the process, there's a way in which the will is over the individual, but also the individual participates in the will, right? You can't just locate will in the ego. If you do that, you're maybe running at risk of ending up in some rivalrous dynamic that gives you the Cuban Missile Crisis. But then you're also don't want to demonize rivalry. It just depends on what you mean. But there's this way in which we have to think about the will as, and I'll be curious how you respond to any of this. We have to think about the will more as an poetic process that we want to maybe
Right.
steward, that we want to help condition and keep going, because there's always the possibility, because I'm thinking Stuart Kaufman now, like there's always the possibility where there was the autopoiesis, there's the possibility also of the autocatalytic, like where suddenly there's a catalyst that automatically arises without the ego intentionally, simply because you keep the process going, right? One thinks of emergence at that point. One thinks about complexity theory. One thinks about, you get Dietrich McCloskey on creativity. You just let people have freedom of speech and you tell them there's dignity in work, and suddenly you get the Industrial Revolution and inventions, because it turns out when people feel free to talk and you also tell them there's dignity in work, following her Bourgeoisie trilogy, an extraordinary book, then people start inventing stuff. Had no idea that would occur, but once we created a self-sustaining process of freedom of speech and dignity in work, you had, dare I say, an autocatalytic. It turned out that that system entailed its own catalyst of unleashing invention
Right.
at a huge
Right.
state. But isn't it funny? Because then you unleash invention precisely by actually thinking a little, like moving away from the ego, actually, and thinking more so of that overall
Yes, exactly.
process.
Mhm.
But I'll give it back to you on any thoughts.
No, I mean, you already said everything. Um, no, I mean, the only thing, it's like, I don't think, yeah, I think autopoiesis, and I think I'm speaking also like in the sense that Maturana meant it, or Luhmann, or I think it's an underlying process. You know, we participated in it anyway. I don't think there's a particularly meaning crisis because from an autopoietic viewpoint, we're always creating meaning, even if that meaning is, oh no, everything is meaningless.
Yep.
You know, for the deeper rooted autopoiesis of the system, it creates the elements that it needs to move forward. Either it may be, you know, maybe in context of the genes, or the social networks, or in terms of psyche, and so in terms of the subject object duality, you mentioned this, is like, yeah, it's on one side it's a construct. It's an arbitrary element that our autopoiesis kind of produced, but it doesn't mean it's not necessary or it's not useful, because like when I want to pay my bills, I need it. I need this very way of thinking. But there are other moments when it's not useful. I mean, it's like, to be quite frank, if I want to have sex, it's not very useful to think in this kind of frame, because the whole purpose, socially, of sex is like to form a unification with somebody, and to overcome that very difference. And so at some point, also, like on the other side of the spectrum, you have meditation, where you also want to overcome the subject object kind of thinking, and form some form of samadhi, or whatever system you use there. So we become aware that there's an autopoiesis of the psyche, and what we can do, and you already alluded to this, is that we're becoming the steerers or the navigators of our own autopoiesis, and kind of can integrate that very process, and kind of supercharge it. And so, like, one example that I give in the book is that what Lacan said between the difference between lack and desire, right? And so this is like a very deep-rooted psychological mechanism that where the autopoiesis kind of does its thing. And so when we experience some lack, we will form a desire to fill that lack. Right. And so there's a dialectic in there. But normally we treat it as a suchness, oh, we have that. We have a lack in terms of money, or we have a lack in terms of relationships, or we have a lack in terms of whatever. But we have to become aware that this is also like a kind of social construct, and to become aware and to use autopoiesis means that we can consciously shift what lack we want to kind of observe in order to create a certain desire. And that kind of liberates us, because we still are, chained to desire machine, what Lacan says, or to the will machine, but we can kind of steer it. We can choose what lack we want to observe, and like what kind of desire we want to use in order to maybe enhance your life, or to make it better, or whatever, right? And so we are not subjected to this whole desire machine like as slaves, but we can use the autopoiesis in order to steer that. And as soon as you do it, it's like you're not acting out of the subject object dualism. You're kind of tuned into a different kind of resonance field, right, with psyche itself. But then there's again the question: where are the limits of psyche? Where are the boundaries? Right? It's like there's nothing that you can point to. That's the end of my psyche. Like, because it's like, and so you're creating a different kind of resonance field that is not necessarily social, symbolic. It's not necessarily historic, biological. It's something else. And so but in any case, from a technical viewpoint and not from a poetic kind of view, because resonance field or sphere, it's kind of a poetic kind of approach. From a technical viewpoint, you become aware of the autopoiesis of your psyche, and you use it to steer that very process.
I think that's absolutely magnificent. I was looking for the quote. You said it very well on this idea on, the spears in the Sloterdijk. There's this notion of kind of examining the spears and the difference, but we need to get at the act of the observation that leads to the spear, because everything you're saying, I think, is actually politically very, very important. Because if you don't see the vision that you just put out, then you're basically
Right.
like, well, there's going to be a bunch of different spears, basically, then foam. that is going to be in their own social intelligibility. And then, of course, that's isomorphic with infinite theory creation. It's where you overly reify diversity to the point where diversity equals coherence, and diversity, there's nothing we can do. It basically is a kind of problem, and it overly spreads, and we just have to learn to live with it. And it's a reasonable political response to totalitarian, a global unity, Neolithic kind of structure of bureaucratic control, a professional managerial class or whatever. But the problem is, once you do that, without going too much into it, a big concern of belonging, again, once it gets a lot into history in three, is the history of the movements between centralization and decentralization. And you see, the problem is we're just kind of caught in that. And you could argue it's repeating now with a lot of the Web 3.0, though it depends. It depends on particularly what companies in Web 3.0. Michelle Bowens, who I adore, will speak about these different. This problem is taking a new realization that we need to avoid just the repetition, because basically, to put it very simply, what usually occurs is you'll have a centralization that is tyrannical. So then there's a swing to decentralization and kind of the creation of many different groups. That works until one of the groups does something one of the other groups thinks is deeply immoral. Like, so for example, we can imagine a world where we form a bunch of new decentralized communities, and one of them's okay with eating meat, and another one thinks that's murder, right? Well, this is the moral real then. And it's okay to talk about difference for people until you start talking about difference that are ethical in a deep way. Like, this group over here thinks it's okay to have, say, AI porn of other people's wives. This one over here does not want you making AI porn of their wife, right? And eventually, unfortunately, that leads to conflict. And then to stop the conflict, you regain centralization, and then you just keep going back and forth forever, and nothing really emerges. And I think basically, until we take seriously what you're talking about, I don't think you're going to move out of that, because you're always going to address the problems of centralization with decentralization. But you see, that's an egoic, if you're not careful, that could just be an egoic response to centralization that then just has a bunch of crystallized egoic structures that then eventually come in conflict, and then it blows up, or it's inefficient, right? So we have to rethink this problem. That would all need to be expanded on. But what you were just saying about desire, a certain level of kind of choosing how we're going to direct these different things. What to me it also suggests is ego as coordinator. There's a certain coordinator the ego has in something autopoietic. Like, you're coordinating the autopoietic process. You're a node in it that's thinking about, how do we want this will, this autopoiesis to unfold, and let us coordinate ourselves relative to it so that it unfolds X way versus Y way, or there's higher probability of that. Well, that structure, in a way, is centralization, but it's also not, because centralization in the negative connotation means there's some ego that's at the top, and it's all centralized around that ego, or even if it's not a tyrant, like a person, it's centralized around basically a value set, like the Washington Consensus or something. And usually it's not all bad. That's too simplistic. It's usually trade-offs. It's always trade-offs with these kind of things. There's goods to it, but there's also bads to it, right? But it's still a centralization that's more egoic in its structure. But decentralization is not an address, because that's actually still egoic as well. You're just creating a bunch of different egos and trying to, de-escalate by not concentrating power. But you're just going to swing forever. But when you start talking about coordination of egos relative to the autopoiesis, it's almost more like I almost want to use the word harmony. That's a word I'll use. And harmony is a unity of difference. It's not replacing difference. It's where the different people find ways to coordinate themselves in relation to the sociological horizon, or in regard to what's unfolding. And everyone is, in a sense, creating something together, which is that autopoiesis, which is that unfolding. But also, if the mechanism of creation of the autopoiesis is more of the autocatalytic, then the result of the autopoiesis can never be predicted and never be brought into the ego, right? So there's something automatically humbling about that. Like, whatever the process is going to create is something that no one can know ahead of time. It has to emerge, to use that word, right? So there's a humility in there. We were talking at the very beginning of the great problem where you have thinking that isn't humbled, or it doesn't have to refer to something outside of its theory, something non-rational, right? Well, in that kind of conception that you're describing, the creative unknowns of the autopoetic process that your job is to keep going and figure out in ways in your own life to condition relative to cannot be predicted ahead of time. And therefore, it is not egoic. It is something that is actually inherently social, but it's not social in a tyrannical way, because that's always the risk. People are concerned, well, that sounds like you're sacrificing the individual for the collective, right? Or that's the other political discussion, which to me, is actually just another way of wording the subject to object split, really. Individual or
Right,
collective.
right.
It's the same problem. It's like, no, there is no collective without the individual, but the collective is not reducible to a collection of individuals. There is activity and relations that emerge in a collective that aren't found except in the collective, which wouldn't exist without individuals, but those ways of behavior only exist in collectives, right? And that sounds tyrannical until you start thinking in terms of autopoiesis, until you start thinking of, oh, this is actually how we can maintain a process that maintains itself without some one individual having to calculate it all or having to figure out it all out, which would ultimately be impossible. There's some more things to say on Lacan with the desired drive, and also I'm now thinking William Ong. But before I get into that, I'll throw at you at any thoughts at anything.
No, I mean, we can't live without conflict and cooperation, and I think that's what you're alluding to. And these are just parts, as soon as you look at social behavior and the social sphere and that we are moving, I call it in the book the ethical sphere. As soon you're exposed to, the eternal conundrum between conflict and cooperation, because these things always go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. You need, in order to have a game of tennis, a competitive conflict-driven game of tennis, you need to adhere to the rules. If you're on the other side, if you have war, you need to adhere to the Geneva Convention, and so it's like there's these internal dualisms and guiding differences that we have. And the question that I posed in the book is like, okay, so what? Because like we can. So one of the other questions that I ask in the book, so what are self-evident truths that we don't have to justify either by creating a dogma or like a infinite regress or like a circular kind of thinking. And one of these self-evident truths of our lives is that we can observe. Right? We can. So and we know this because we can talk about this. So at some point we had to start to do this. And we had to become aware that we are beings that can observe. And so what happened at that point in our evolutionary history, when we became online, let's say. And so I think that created a problem. That created, on one side, it created solutions for some evolutionary problems that we had at that time, but it also created some problems. And the problem is, so what do I do with this arising consciousness? So suddenly, it's like I'm leaving the Garden Eden behind, to use a Christian metaphor, and I start to consciously relate to other people. Suddenly you open up a sphere of ethics, of social coordinated behavior, where you either have to choose to cooperate or to go into conflict. And this is also like a kind of autopoietic mechanism, because these systems differentiate itself by the millennia in forms of ethics and ethical, into politics and education, all these kinds of things. Another sphere that opens up with consciousness itself is that I have to relate to the world per se. I'm not just embedded in the world as an animal. I suddenly am able to use my hands to create tools. And technology in the most banal, basic kind of way arose, And then another issue, of course, is what do I do with consciousness itself? Suddenly I'm aware that I'm aware. So that creates a different guiding difference in another sphere of autopoiesis. And the last one, because you mentioned that in the beginning, is art, basically. So we are able to create representations of our own perceptions in a kind of way, in a more or less artistic kind of way. And so, but in terms of the ethical sphere, we see ourselves suddenly, Heidegger uses the word geworfen sein, to be thrown into a certain Dasein and a certain form of being. And we suddenly have to contend with the fact that there is somebody else that wants something that I want, or that, or it's like, and we are either cooperating to get the thing, or we go into conflict. And so all, René Girard and mimetic desire and all of these things come rushing in and form our basic understanding of religion, because it's like, what is religion? Something else than to find ways to not kill each other. I saw just, on a side note, I saw this wonderful movie. It's called The Return, where, Odysseus comes back from the Trojan War. Have you seen that one?
I haven't, but I was looking at that. Is it good?
Yeah, and so he comes back from the Trojan War and all of his experiences and to the shores of Ithaca, a broken old man basically, and he doesn't know should he reveal himself as king, because the kingdom is in utter disarray. His woman waits for 15 years, and new suitors are there to claim the kinghood and whatever. But he is old and he doesn't know, and it's all filmed in this kind of way that the people wear like fur of animals, because it was not the age of like golden armor. It was like the end of the Bronze Age where that supposedly happened. And so what happens is that it basically plays 500 years before Christ, right? And before Christianity. And they behaved that way. There was no forgiveness. There was no mercy. There was no, it was a very brutal kind of way to organize our social living together. And that makes the movie so interesting. So what was a society before the Christian, ethics descended upon us, basically? And it was not nice. I can tell you this. And it was not a Brad Pitt movie. It was not a Brad Pitt kind of, setup, where everything is beautiful and shiny. It was ugly and violent and bloody and everything. And so we had to develop rules. And there's a kind of autopoiesis embedded into this interplay and dialectic between cooperation and conflict. And so, yeah, that comes to mind.
No, that was brilliant. Well, it brings to mind. So, you have that point, and I think it speaks to perhaps the issue of emphasizing meaning. Because it's not that meaning, there clearly is for people a quote unquote meaning crisis, if by that we mean they create meaning, but no meaning they create is meaningful to them or significant to them, or it can't compel their actions. You almost need to talk about the meaningful meaning crisis, really, is kind of what I hear when people talk about that. And yeah, you see something where people are like, what's the point?
It's contradiction. It's a performative contradiction.
Yes, that's the key. Yeah, and Samuel Barnes has a lovely book talking about nihilism, missing axioms, and the iconoclast that I suggest talking about that as well, which is brilliant. But what you have this point where you says, as long as there is a world, as long as the world challenges us, as long as we have inner difficulty and crises, that is precisely why we will also have meaning. The reason why I think that's important is because that means...
I wrote that?
You did?
He wrote that.
No,
I
you
did.
wrote that. Yeah, I got it all marked on page 119. It's really nice. But you see I like that, because we were saying a minute ago that the political challenge is the swing between centralization and decentralization. Focusing on meaning ultimately would just get you back to that swinging, right? Because you could create meaning by just simply going into decentralization, right? Or kind of atomizing into a consistency. You can make meaning by making a new theory of consciousness, right? A new crystalline structure, right? And you see and then the very mechanism of creating meaning creates conflict. It creates tension and different things. So you'd really need to talk about the ability to handle conflict, or to figure out how to coordinate conflict toward the autopoiesis, right? Where you're not it's more of a skillfulness of knowing how to work with tension, coordinate difference, not simply creating meaning. Because if you're not careful, all that may do is lead to another crystalline structure. Now, obviously, people like Vervaeke emphasizes relation, emphasizes working with other people, serious play, and those would be the things one would want to move into to avoid meaning just leading to crystalline structure. So it, of course, always just depends on what you mean by the word. But restoring meaning, well, I always make the point that we do know how to address the meaning crisis. You just, go back to tribalism, nationalism, fundamental religion. Like there is, in a sense, the meaning crisis is not knowing how to get meaning. We do know how to get meaning. The problem is we don't like the classical options of getting meaning, which are
Right.
racism and going back. The meaning crisis for me, is a sign of hope, is the phrase I like to use. And the reason for that, it's more like the image I always have is Thomas More in like A Man for All Seasons. Like he knows how he can leave the prison. He just grants the divorce, right? But he won't do it because it goes against his principles. And maybe he's wrong, but it's more like he's choosing to submit himself to the prison, right? Relative to what he believes, right? Well, again, the meaning crisis, it's not that we don't know how to get meaning. We know how to do it. We just don't like the options and are looking for a new way. Honest, like we're looking for a different way. But here's the issue. To stick that landing, it's going to have to come to the political, and it's going to have to come to the material condition, and it's going to have to come into handling conflict and tension. And if you overemphasize meaning, then individuals may do that which they find meaningful, but then just create ego, go into the egotistic and stay in the ego. And that's not going to move to the autopoiesis. It's just going to swing in the pendulum between centralization and decentralization. Please, please.
No, 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 because it's like we're talking about meaning crisis, and I would just interject for our listeners that I don't believe there is a meaning crisis
Sure.
or meta crisis. It's a concept, it's like orienting generalization. And then when you're becoming aware of social autopoiesis, you have to ask if this is the correct orienting generalization. Because if you start to think, to view the world in form of, the world is in crisis and the world is in a meaning crisis, then you will create the observations that justify the model that you had to begin with. And so the question is, why don't we talk about, the meta possibility that we have, or the meaning possibility that we have? Why are we so, bound to this kind of alarmism that Freud already talked about in Civilization and its Discontents? It's like every generation has its alarmist, and it's like every generation is dire in dire need of help and rescue. It's a very Protestant kind of way of thinking, according to Freud. And it's like, okay, so let's take autopoiesis seriously, and let's determine what we want to think about these things in the future. Let's not talk about the impending doom and the crisis. Let's talk about it as a heightened chance of possibility that we have, right?
Well, that's why I'm a big fan of saying the meaning crisis is a sign of hope. Because if you emphasize crisis, then actually it's a condition that invites new, well, to use a Hegelian term, sublative possibility or reorientations. That if the quote unquote crisis did not occur, then you wouldn't think the new orientation. You would not think the new conditionality, right?
Right.
So it is extremely important, because the other problem from a language critique, the other problem with the word crisis is politically what that usually looks like is an emphasis on individuals changing their habits, while the overall structure doesn't really change that much, right? Like when you talk about the environmental crisis, there usually is not much of thinking, different systems, different social organizations. It's more like you need to recycle. The word crisis tends to lend itself in the direction of individual changes. Right. And you see, that's where you get into some issues, because the autopoietic is located more in the social. It's going to be located more in working with otherness, tearing with the negativity of otherness and different things, right? And so the word crisis has traditionally lended itself either in the direction of individual habit changing or big government programs. And that's on the side of giant centralization. And, Rothbard will always say the state is not the society, right? You lose the social. The social is lost in the language of crisis. In fact, you tend to become very, witch hunting. You start witch hunting the social, because those people aren't recycling. Those people are doing the bad thing. And that's what we've seen. Crises, political crises, that language usually leads to individualism or stateism, but not social. It tends to work against the social. So I agree with you on the dangers of that language. Now, if by crisis we mean in some traditions where crisis is also opportunity, I did Latin for a number of years, and I think one of the words for crisis means opportunity. That's fine, but that's not what we mean. Certainly not politically, certainly not in the news. So there's a real danger there. I agree with what you're saying.
Or also
Really,
in the attractor base, sorry to interrupt you, but also in the attractor basin of how we normally use the word crisis. It's in most cases it's a negative, it's not a positive. I mean,
right.
even if it's historically, if it's embedded the positivity in there, it's like in our it's in our daily use, it's very adjacent to negativity and all
Yep.
these, drama and conflicts and strokes of fate that we encounter. And so it's like why do we want to use a word that's so laden with negativity and negative connotations?
Well, I think also it makes me think of the Odysseus example that you were making with the return. That makes me think of what you were saying. And, Hannah Arendt will talk about how forgiveness and humility were vices in the ancient world, and then Christianity made them virtues. Very fascinating. And a lovely example that I think is relevant here for the political question that I always like to turn to is Hamlet, because we're all Hamlet now. And the key to Hamlet is he's in a Christian society, and his father shows up dressed as Apollo and tells him to get revenge. So he's caught between the ethical systems of forgiveness and revenge as being ethical, right? And he's split down the middle, almost like the Colossus of Rhodes, right? And many of Shakespeare's, one would have to go into detail on this, many of Shakespeare's plays, I think, are actually often caught between competing ethical systems, between Athens and Jerusalem, if you will. And these characters are like that. And the problem is, if you use the word crisis, then that could mean, well, what Hamlet needs to do is either choose Athens or choose Jerusalem. No, that is reality. The betweenness, the caught between, the human condition of the betweenness is actually what is constitutive of the human condition because of the observation of which can make Athens or Jerusalem, right? So
Right.
if you emphasize crisis, then you could solve the crisis by simply choosing Athens or Jerusalem. And actually, the word crisis may actually tempt you to do that, which then you're just swinging between centralization and decentralization, Athens and Jerusalem. What we have to do is accept and learn to live with, carry with the meaning crisis condition in a will, the meaning condition, the observer condition that Hamlet represents. As an example, one of the
Right.
most fascinating parts of the play that many scholars will say is actually a mistake is when Hitler, Hitler, that's funny. When Hamlet
Yeah,
goes,
sorry, I'm German.
sorry, whoops. So when Hamlet, every conversation has to mention Hitler once, right? So that was my subconscious making sure I met the quota.
I
So
was just waiting for
it
it.
was
Yes.
just waiting for it. But the part where Hamlet goes to kill Claudius, and Claudius is praying, and Hamlet's like, well, if I kill him now, he'll go to heaven, so I better not to. This is extraordinary because he's basically saying, I'm going to do what's ethical following Achilles in a Christian worldview. So I'm going to follow the ethics of Athens, per se, in the metaphysics of Jerusalem. And so he decides not to kill Claudius. And it's this extraordinary, clash of worlds that are hitting one another that are the kind of, well, honestly, those are the kind of ethical possibilities that open up in pluralism, in the world today, where you have different ethical systems. And you see, that's what has to be thought. That's what has to be worked with. And if you overemphasize the word crisis, the other problem with the word crisis is that it makes it sound like, oh my gosh, we took a wrong turn. Now we're at a dead end. We got to go back. It has a nostalgic structure to it, as if and it also makes you out to be an idiot. Like we did something stupid. Now we're in a crisis. No, I wouldn't say modernity was a mistake. I wouldn't say postmodernism was a mistake. All these things brought extremely important lessons with them.
Sure.
The problem is either overfitting them, underfitting them, over making them autonomous. It would be like saying rationality is a mistake. No, rationality is extremely important. The problem is when it becomes autonomous or unbound coherence, like we were saying at the beginning, right? If you have non-rationality without rationality, well, this can just be fanaticism, right? But if you have rationality without the non-rational, well, then you can just get crystalline structures that multiply forever, right? So it's always, again, I am a fan of the Hegelian notion of the sublation, as Ebert will talk about, and Cadell is this bringing of the old into the new, but it's always a bringing. That's what we have to think. And the very condition of the problem of meaning, if you will, which is that humans have to create something they find meaningful. The problem of meaning is that we must have meaning. That's the problem. We must have meaning. We must have coherence. And meaning and coherence have a way of making us be in these crystalline structures, or ever proliferating into new theories of meaning or new theories of consciousness or new possibilities of it. The problem of meaning is meaning itself, right? And if you don't take that condition, if you don't take that seriously, it falls into the egoic, and it's just going to swing politically between decentralization and centralization, and you'll never move to autopoiesis. You'll never move into thinking, well, actually, there is meaning, and the question is, how do we condition ourselves to it, and do we let the process of meaning making per se continue itself, right? As opposed to how do I bring it to myself, right? Well, once you do that, you're in the individual, and then I'll give it to you for any thoughts. Or you're going to say, well, we need to take control of the government to make sure that our meaning is safe, right? And then you just get political warfare. Like if you're a Christian, you're like, well, we got to make sure the president's Christian, or we got to make sure they're atheist or liberal or whatever, because then our meaning is threatened, right? Like if you have the wrong conception of meaning separate from autopoiesis, it's going to lead to just infinite political war, because everyone wants to make sure that their meaning is safe. And by the way, if your meaning is the meaning, well, then you're kind of justified, right? To make sure that that meaning is what the government defends, because otherwise everything will be nihilism. Everything will be meaningless, right? So we got to make sure that our guy wins for their sake, for the other's sake, right? So that they have the thing that is meaningful. So if you're not careful, I think the political ramifications can be significant, but let me throw it at you.
Well, I mean, it's very difficult because, I mean, as far as I know personally from my life, and I think everybody knows it's life is not, it's not nice, and life is complicated and painful and a struggle, right? And when we have these meaning systems, they try to sell us some, easiness and coziness and comfort, which is kind of devoid of, the baser truths of life. And I was just reading, a fascinating book by Guattari and Deleuze. It's called Nomadology. I don't know if you've read it. And so it's like he talks about, that the state is formed by an interior that is built by the king and the chief. And then they create meaning for the sociant in a kind of way. But these two, they can't be without the third. And the third is the warrior. And the warrior is always, because thinking of this because you mentioned Achilles, because the warrior is always against these two by nature. And these two need the warrior in order to keep things going. And they hate the warrior because they hate him as much as Agamemnon hated Achilles, because Achilles is the perfect warrior in a kind of sense. But also the warrior is the one that invented war, right? And he invented the technology in order to wage war. And so if you look at humans' history and our sociology, like we all want a society without war. Of course, because like war is the most dehumanizing thing that anybody can imagine. But the reality of it is like we need war. Mm-hmm. It's simple as that. It's like how can we deal with this? How can we deal with this human conundrum that in order to have meaning, we need war? And it's what it is. And I don't know how to frame that properly, because everybody, because it's such an ugly thing. But there are some. We're not nice people. We're predators. We're killers. It's what we are in a kind of sense. And as long as you want to create like a perfect ideology or philosophy, you basically invite the warrior to destroy it. That's what it is. That's what always happens. There is no idea that in a singular fashion can stand for its own without inviting. As long as you have the will to coherence, there will be an element. Baudrillard calls it the symptom, the element that hijacks the whole system, and we see it. So Wilber's integral theory invited, a whole slew of postmodern theories that kind of, navigated outside, of this kind of postmodern field of thinking. But it took like half a year till the meta-modern philosophy crumbled because of its inconsistencies. And so it's like that's how meaning is done. It's through conflict and cooperation, but you can't get rid of conflict. Yeah. And if and I think you can also attest to it. I think like maturation and growing old means to be able to integrate conflict and to say no. You know, it's like if you start a business and you're like 25 or 30, it's your first business, and you're clamoring for, you know, offers, and you want to do the trial thing, and you don't take the prices that you should take because you're starting out new. But the more experience you get, you know, the more you can say no. It's not, that's not, I'm not doing this. Right. And the funny paradoxical thing is the more you can say no, the better the business works. It's strange.
It
You
is.
know, this so it's like and it's philosophy and discussing ideas, it's always the same. It's like the harnessing of conflict. It's like it's a funny joke, has been done many times, but there's this video of Sean Connery saying he likes to slap women. He never had to, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. He never had to because he was able to integrate that. He was able to say no. And so at some point we have to say no. We have to go into conflict, either implicitly or directly. And so that's a problem, you know, because like, you know, all these kind of postmodern new age kind of things that, you know, existed in the 70s, 80s. Oh, we need love and harmony, and this is all fine and dandy, but that's not how it works.
No, I think it's, well, there is a conflation of the words love and nice when they're actually
Yeah,
not the same thing. You know, people, I always mention this, you know, Chekhov, he says something like, the key to understanding people who love one another is that they're constantly misunderstanding one another. You know, you don't
right,
tend to misunderstand strangers. And actually, the closer you come, it's like the hedgehog dilemma. The more you hurt one another, people who love you can hurt you, but not people that don't. So what's so interesting is that actually love entails a mechanism of intensifying the likelihood of conflict and the depth of conflict in its very goodness. Like the very goodness of
right,
love creates the condition of pain. And if it didn't, it would not be love, right? And that's
right,
always, I think, a revelation of the highest states or emotions of human beings is that they're multidimensional. You can't reduce love to niceness. It entails niceness and beauty and hardship and the real and surprise and lots of things, right? If you can reduce love to niceness, you're actually talking about maybe liking, not really love, right? Certainly not passion. The word passion, you know, it means suffering. What you are willing, you're passionate about what you're willing to suffer for, right? If you're not willing to suffer for it, then you don't have a passion for it. You may like it, it may be enjoyable, but you don't have a passion for it, right? So there are these
right.
multidimensional things. What you were saying on war, it makes me think, and Owen and Agon, he also wrote under Raymond, he talks a lot about the classic soul, tripart soul, and Limburg will it well at the Stoa, where you have eros, logos, and themos, right? And you have to have all three. You know, if you don't have eros, which you
Right.
can generally associate with desire, you die. If you don't have logos, then you're dead. You can't think. But if you don't have themos, you die. And what's very interesting is all three of them maintain the appetites of the other. Without themos, logos and eros take over, right? Without eros, themos and logos take over and ruin the society. And without logos, eros and themos take over, right? So you have to have all
Right.
three. And what Owen points out that I think is critical is that Plato thought about the role of the philosopher of keeping a successful society from destroying itself. And the reason why is because a successful society almost always loses one of the three. And ours is one that has lost the most, ergo conflict, war, etc., so forth, right? And so the role of the philosopher is actually not so much, as Plato describes it, it's not really so much on the side of problem and solution, but almost more problem management or situation management. You go, okay, we have a successful society. That means probably themos is at risk. Or if maybe it's Vikings or something, logos is at risk. So we got to make sure the logos doesn't become deficient in this society. Oh, in this society, we got to make sure the themos is not sufficient. Because if that occurs, we're in huge trouble, right? But here's the reason why you need philosophy. By definition, it will not seem as if you need that thing that's being lost because the society is successful. So it becomes an abstraction. The philosopher is trying to defend necessary things that become abstractions in the success of the society, right? but they're abstractions not because they're not concrete or necessary, but because success makes them invisible. It makes them go away. You have to reclaim them by thought, basically. Or creating environments where, like the gymnasium, you're wrestling, you're engaging in conflict and fight, right? Where the society makes a point to have social spaces where you can have the experience of the thing that is most at risk. And I think it's true, in our world today, it's probably Themos. It is Themos, dang it. Even Francis Fukuyama at the end of history, he's more interesting in that book because he also realizes neoliberalism, which I know is a word that is a difficult word, but if by that we mean Washington consensus, democracy plus capital markets, pricing coordination, trade, et cetera, so forth. What Francis Fukuyama notes is that capitalism is going to put at risk Themos. And he posits that, well, maybe climbing the corporate ladder, maybe competition between markets, maybe that will be enough for war, the need for war. Maybe that will be enough for Themos. I don't think that thesis is proven true because those who get their Themos from that tend to be higher up the corporate ladder. Maybe if you're higher up, maybe if you're at the intense decisions and you feel like the generals, maybe, but it does not seem as if market competition, I don't want to say never, but it doesn't seem as if it can address fully the deficiency of Themos. And I don't think it's also by chance you see this explosion of things like jujitsu or this hunger for people watching extreme sports like UFC or different things. Like there is a subconscious acknowledgement of the need for violence. Because the thing is about meaning. People don't really care about meaning unless it brings a feeling of triumph with it, a feeling of glory, right? And how do you get glory? You went on the wrestling mat and you did something miraculous. You came out on top. And also to glory in this sense does not come from beating someone you're better than, but someone who's better than you or someone as good of you or at the state champion. Like there are stakes, right? You can't really have meaning unless there are stakes and risk. Like a meaning that you can't fail at will not feel meaningful to you. That's also kind of a critical notion. There has to be risk. And if there has to be risk, there has to be conflict because you're risking losing the conflict or a conflict with your own soul, at least, as you overcome your anxieties about starting a business or something. Without that, you can't get a feeling of triumph. And without triumph and glory or overcoming, you're not going to care about logos. You're not going to care about eros. You're not going to care about desire. So you have to maintain all three parts of the soul. Also, too, I think what you were saying about we need war, I would just note, I think that's hard for us to think because our conception of war is too dressed in technology. We imagine people launching missiles and drones at one another. No, let's go to Achilles, hand-to-hand combat, more spears and stuff like that. When you think about that, you need that kind of aggression. Then war is not so much, when we talk about it here, a technological employment against other people, because that's actually not thematic. This is the problem. Modern war is actually not thematic. It actually isn't scratching it isn't getting at what people need. That's part of the problem and why we are, I know drone technologies have accelerated now because of the Russian-Ukraine and just some of these drones that are being developed. Like one can imagine, because we're not actually scratching or addressing Themos, we then try to do war through more logos, and then drones take over. And that's going to almost be the worst. You've got war, but not Themos. It's like it's the great perversion we are now at risk at, right? So we need to think, like, to talk about needing war. You need to go into the forest and cut trees down. You need to do things that are risky. Ivan Illich talks about disablement versus enablement. I always associate that with Themos. We exist in a very disabled age. We can't build our own house. We can't do things with our hands. We can't, and it doesn't have to be physical even. Just the ability to know how to walk into a room and talk with people and actually know how to carry a conversation. That's a skill. That's thymotic. If you can't work a room, or you can't talk with the other sex, or you can't do business transactions, or you can't sit down to do taxes without having a mental breakdown, those too are thymotic. Because to me, and I'd be curious what you think about this, to me, thymotic has a lot to do with the feeling of I have what it takes. Like I can do this. Like I actually have a capacity to go into this place, right? Now, of course, what's so interesting is thymotic then by definition runs the risk of destroying the autopoiesis, right? Because you're thinking, I have what it takes. Well, why do I need the social then, right? Well, that's where you need the eros, and that's where you need the logos to balance it, right? And ultimately, what comes to mind is the autopoiesis that you're describing about is only in the society or is only maintained where all three are there: logos, eros, themos. And I think Plato understood that in some of the classical thoughts. Like if you don't have all three, you won't have the autopoiesis. It's going to actually, well, it will become, well, this, I'll be curious about this because I'm now thinking, again, Ebert, instead of autopoiesis, you get cancer, which is something that won't die. And it keeps spreading to the point where it kills everything. So what you get without themos, because themos contains the appetites of eros and logos, you get eros and logos that won't, they just grow themselves without themos, and then they become cancerous, right? Or you get themos and eros without logos, and it grows and becomes cancerous, right? Because cancer is a result of a cell that refuses to die, right? It seems it is a kind of autopoiesis, but it is not the one that is actually bringing out the social. And the process of the human that can ultimately prove autocatalytic, as we're describing, you have to have all three. And so what we almost have now is, because we don't have conflict, we don't have themos, we have a system that's creating itself in a kind of, improper and unfully formed and quote unquote cancerous way, where as we're getting a deficiency of themos, we then say, well, let's address it by getting more logos. Let's just get smarter. Or let's address it with eros by getting more meaning that's an idea on a theory, right? And so you spread that culture that's getting in the way of the autopoiesis, or that it is actually hindering the development of the human being. I'd be curious on, those were just thoughts that were coming to mind as you were speaking. I'd be curious your thoughts on any of that.
I think for the autopoiesis doesn't care for the political system or how well it runs. Autopoiesis is how social communication works and how genomes and genes reproduce.
Sure.
It's not about the way that we think. It doesn't really care about, if it's democracy or if it's a well-running democracy, if it's a tyranny or dictatorship or whatever it is. It's just like all these are valid forms for the social autopoiesis. It's just like the autopoiesis just means the underlying social mechanism of communication, basically, in a Luhmann sense. But that what you say about tumors is interesting because I don't know if you have read Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher. He's very interesting. Have you read him?
Yes.
And so he talks about about democracy, and in your words, how tumors is always embedded into it and breaks forth periodically, where the program of democracy itself is kind of put aside for a moment, and where a quasi-dictator can run and rule the city or the country. And he mentions Washington, and he mentions, for example, Roosevelt. And Roosevelt said in one of his first kind of addresses, either you give me all your power or I take it. Right. And so he ran the place for 16 years, basically, if I grow, or nearly 16 years. And so that should have not have been happened with democratic rule. Democracy can only in the sense of Agamben, democracy can only stabilize itself through moments of state of exception, where a quasi king, or Lincoln did the same thing in a period of couple of months, where he reigned as a king in order to bring order to the United States. And so there you have moments of thymus, I don't know how you pronounce it in English, breaking forth, and restabilizing the system from within. And the problem, of course, is, talking about Roosevelt and that time, that and Will is like since basically 1945, there is a reluctance to talk about will culturally, because it's so much concerned, it's so much attached to the will to power and Nietzsche and the the Nazis, and so nobody really wants to touch the issue of will, basically, because it wreaked so much havoc, basically, the misinterpretation that the Nazis did. And so what we're left with is a society that's kind of devoid of thymus. I mean, I just told you, in the preparation of the talk, I was just in Paris and I visited this grandiose museum of Auguste Rodin, and it is just like what he did is just thymus in concretion, like grand statues and grand pieces of art that you need this will to create and to do and to excel and to succeed on a grand scale, and we're kind of left in our culture with mediocrity. It's like, where is the
Yeah.
great art right
Yeah.
now?
Right.
It's like, is it a Taylor Swift or what is it? It's like, where are these grand philosophies and these new pieces of art, and the great cathedrals, and the things that show, oh no, we can reach the stars in a kind of way. It's like, I don't want to talk about Musk. That was not alluding to Musk. It's like, but where, looking at Rodin and looking at these images of, the painting of Picasso, like, where are these great feats
Yeah.
that are only possible, or like, even politically speaking, like, only through tumors? And it's like, in a kind of way, what I try to instill through this book is like, let's talk about themes, let's talk about will, let's talk about war, let's talk about all these adjacent things, about libido and sexuality and all these things that are uncomfortable in a certain way, that are outside the corridor of of comfort, and that are necessary to stabilize the system from a broader view. And I think you could make a case that's also part of the autopoiesis
Mm.
of the thing. And I think that could, it's like, a way of contributing to the overall dialogue and to the overall, cultural setting that we have right now. And in a way, it's culture that decides if these are topics worthwhile discussing. But in a sense, I feel that there's a lack of tumors at the moment.
No, I think that's well put. Well, so there's a few things. No, very, very important point. Autopoiesis is happening. And I think that's important because it's happening. And perhaps a way that can be worded is the question of, will it be cancerous or will it be nesting? But of course, if a human doesn't have the possibility of cancer, then they're dead because there are no cells, right? So there has to be the possibility of the cancerous. There has to be the possibility in the system of the exception breaking forth, or the thing is not there, right? So to live is to risk, right? And so I think it's very important. There is autopoiesis. It is occurring. It's simply the question of the way that it occurs, right? And I think Plato would argue that the autopoiesis without all three parts of the soul, eros, logos, themos, which I may not be pronouncing correctly, will be quote unquote cancerous in the bad way, as opposed to, say, nesting or flow or self-forgetful in the things that we are describing, right? But that's very important because that means autopoiesis is not a choice. You're in the game. It's happening. The question is,
Yeah, sure.
are you, game's on. So are you going to reconcile yourself with it, to use that Hegelian term? Are you going to accept that you are limited from living in a world where there isn't autopoiesis and find freedom in that, or not? We don't have a culture that helps people make those choices in a
You
way that would,
cannot not want. You can't
yeah, yeah,
not desire. It's like it's you're subjected to the machine,
that's
and it's
correct.
like you have to find, and maturation means to find a way to wrestle with this and to integrate it in a kind of sense.
Oh, no, I think absolutely. And what you were speaking about, Roosevelt, it makes me think of Marcus Olson's important book on the rise and fall of nations. And that's basically the logic of collective action. Basically, he makes the following argument. He's like, basically, governments always with time are taken over by special interest groups like K Street that destroy their growth, shrink them, make them mediocre, and so on. And he makes this point. He has this. He's like, why is it that Japan and Germany and a lot of Europe, which was completely devastated after World War II, managed to actually become quite successful within 30 or 40 years, right? They climbed, Japan, for example. And he's like, well, because the war destroyed all the special interest groups. And so the government was actually able to function. It's like a forest
Right.
fire that allowed new growth. And he was just making the
Right.
point. He's like, and another book called The Great Leveling talks about basically it's the plagues, it's the wars, it's the existential crises that give governments a second shot. Otherwise, they become ostracized, they become frozen up, right? In the same way, you could argue intellectualism tends to escape infinite coherence building when there's a real crisis. And we have, or there's a vision of going to the moon or going out west. That's when intellectualism seems to be more likely. Well, let's put it this way. The intellectual without the explorer mentality ends up probably in the game of coherence, just building coherence. And the same can happen with the artist. The artist who is not also like Hemingway, is going to perhaps end up in some trouble of just building narcissism, towers to narcissism. But you see, the issue is that basically that goes back to what you were saying on the king and the priest and the warrior. Modern societies tend to get rid of the warrior, without which the priest and the king end up in what Marcise Olson is talking about. They
Right.
become stagnated, and the warrior comes along and kills the special interest groups, kills the suitors per se, and then it gets back to where it needs to be. We have not created the conditions for this not to be the game.
Right.
Because that would require thinking the social and autopoiesis in the way that you're putting forth, and to have a new conception of the will. And I think what you were saying about we don't have a society of greatness, I think we fear greatness. I think also we don't like greatness because it judges you. When you encounter greatness, it says to you, well, hey, you must change your life, right? And that Rilke poem, or when you encounter greatness, there's always a judgment in greatness. Of course, it's like, why aren't you great? Why don't you do more? And
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
have,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you
Mm.
have the choice, and this may go to just to use that metaphoric language of cancer versus nesting or cancer versus flow. The choice there is inspiration or resentment, right? Do you then say, you know what? Yeah, I can do it, right? Or do you become resentful? Well, here's the problem. If you don't have a society that thinks the social to provide resources or spaces or whatever for people who are inspired, well, then even if they are inspired by greatness, they end up alone, stagnated, lost in their apartment room or in the ego, unless they just get lucky and find three other people. And so then they tend to fall back in, it's unlikely they'll make it, right? And then they could be even more resentful because then they tried and didn't get there. And maybe they're even more resentful than the one who just started resentful of greatness. But this is where, for me, the social coordination mechanism that is what we're doing online with these different communities where people are finding one another actually can be very good, because it can bring back ways to sustain inspiration, especially where we don't have eldership, especially where we don't have family. Now, it could become a crystallized structure of people just enjoying talking to one another, but it could also be an incubator of, and Lindbergh was talking, the magnanimous, the love of great things. To be magnanimous is not pride, it's to love great things, right? It is very difficult to love great things alone without it becoming you being the great thing in narcissism, right? Very hard to have magnanimity and it not be egotistical without a social condition that helps sustain the inspiration,
Right.
sustain greatness. And otherwise, our experience of greatness tends to be one of judgment. And guess what? Logos can come in here and get rid of that and say, well, it's just subjective anyway. It's just taste anyway. Oh, I can create a new theory of consciousness. I'll show them, right? But the problem is logos is in the driver's seat there. It looks like you're seeking greatness, but actually you're looking for self-congratulations. And there is a difference
Right.
between greatness and self versus self-congratulations. Like the great art, yeah, of course there's a strong self, if you will. There is a strong person to do it. But very often, obviously some of them are to God. They're they're statues, right? There's some sort of idea of creating something, even with Finnegan's Wake. Literary scholars will start this for 30 years, long after I'm dead, right? And sure, there is narcissism and different things in this, but there's also a kind of idea of the great conversation of literature. There is the idea of the canon. There's the idea of culture, that these things will be added to, right? Because I think about this, like, what's the difference between those things? Like, if you don't have a culture that really believes in, well, maybe this is the way. I'd be curious what you may think. If you don't have culture, you just have content. Maybe that's a way to put it. Then people can't make content and at least have a chance of balancing the ego by putting it in the culture and saying it is now part of the culture, right? Of course, there's the risk of the ego. There has to be, just like there has to be the risk of cancer, but at least if there's a culture or social coordination or different things, content can be placed in something beyond the ego. That's autopoiesis. But if people don't feel like there's a culture, or culture is fragmented into isolated silos, then it's much more likely that content becomes just ego expression or something like that. That's a live thought, and I know that was a lot. Any thoughts to any of that? I'd be curious, because that's just a live thought I'm thinking.
No, it's like I don't know who said it. Was it Sprengler that we are like a Faustian
Yes, it's
kind of
Spangler. Yeah, yeah,
society?
yeah.
Yeah, so and in a kind of sense, we're needing we are a culture that thrives with goals and thrives with self betterment and all these kind of things, and there's a figure that always appears in philosophy throughout the ages, and that's the figure of the diamond in a kind of way. And I think I'm writing a little bit about the book. It's like it's not really clear what it is. It appears in Schopenhauer, it appears in different places as a voice of a higher self, or as a mediator between God and man, as somebody, as an entity that kind of speaks to you from the future or endows you with certain abilities. Because when we talk about great pieces of art and listen to the people who actually created them, they're never saying I did this.
Right.
It's like they were like kind of connected to some higher principle, whatever that is, and that's why it's the symbol of the diamond is kind of occult. Half of it is known, and necessarily half of it is unknown, and it must be, because if we could fully understand what that thing is, it would lose its creative power, and so we need a moment and to come back and maybe put a framing in all of this in order to overcome the subject object dualism in terms of wanting something and willing in the world. It's like, okay, we can leave that behind and build a resonance field with something higher that we don't know exactly what it is. Let's call it a diamond, right? Let's a creative power through which we are able to mimic or to achieve greatness. Not mimic is not the right word, but at least to try to overcome and to succeed in what we're doing. And so there's a whole eudaimonia, a whole life what's the English word, art of living attached to it, Lebenskunst, to overcome our worldly bounds and connect to something higher, and to use the autopoiesis in a kind of way to strive to something higher. That might be religious, that might be artistic, that might be ethical, speaking again about the spheres or technological. That kind of doesn't matter, as long as we have a guiding principle that points beyond what we're having now, and we can't escape our culture. That's our way of thinking anyway, because that's why we're here. That's the source code and operating system of our culture. That's what the reason why you can wipe out Germany basically completely. And yeah, I think the idea was to make like a farmland out of this, till Marshall said, okay, no, let's reshape that in a kind of American kind of way. And 5 years later, you had the miracle of economics taking hold of Germany, and so, because that's the system that works. That's why the West, to quote Jim Morrison, is the best. So it's like it's kind of self-ironic, because we have this drive to do stuff. So I meant this in a kind of ironic kind of way, because it's you have to put this in brackets as well. But I mean, we had Bach and we had Beethoven and Mozart and Rodin and all these people, and it's like, where does that drive come from? Is it geological? Is it like weather, because it's so cold in France and Germany and in England that you had to do? There's nobody knows, but there's a Faustian impulse there, and all we can do is kind of use it.
Well, I mean, to everything you're saying, so there's a few things. I think what you're describing of art as necessarily having a certain mystery to it, it's, when people ask what is art, a lot of answers to that. But I think a key characteristic is it unveils with the UN in parentheses. When it unveils, there's also something hidden, and desire works that way. Like if you have the entirety of a thing, you cease to desire it. Like Marcis Blondel made this joke where he's like, it's really weird that modern philosophy is obsessed with certainty because what you're certain about, you don't care about. So philosophy was engaged in a certain suicidal mission if its goal was certainty. Whereas if something is totally veiled, though, you also don't care about it because you don't know it's there, right? Like if a book is not readable at all, then it's bad, right? Art is able to find the mean, which in Aristotle is not merely the middle, but the fittingness, the kind of condition in the cooking to make it work, where you experience an unveiling with the UN in parentheses, a certain bothness. And that moves beyond the object-subject divide, right? Because it means the object changes based on the life circumstance or work of the subject that then changes the subject to see more and more, and you get a kind of feedback loop between those two things, right? Because there's an unveiling. And I really do think, I don't think something is art if it doesn't do that, right? Now, you could
Right.
also argue that one of the goals of art, which philosophy also does if it's actually doing what it's supposed to do, is actually increases the probability of experience more of the world, more of life in terms of unveiling with the UN in parentheses, right? And the best conversations are ones where you know what you're going to talk about, but you also don't know where it's going to go. The best relationships are the ones where you know what happens, but you don't know. Without mystery, there is not desire, and we get nihilism, right? But or bad nihilism. It just depends on what you mean by that. So human beings are at their best where there is an unveiling structure with the UN in parentheses, right? And basically, all of our conceptions of the will, as you have so well pointed out and argued, do not make space for unveiling thinking, per se. Because
Right.
the will is best unveiled, per se, with the UN in parentheses, but that is located in the social. It is not going to be overly in the state, and it will not be overly in the individual, because it will be completed, right? You need incompleteness. Incompleteness, in the Kurt Gödel sense or whatever, which will bring us to Lacan, is actually a really great thing because incompleteness with the IN in parentheses is the possibility of autopoiesis. You could not have autopoiesis where a thing was complete, right? Processes aren't complete. They are themselves, right? So even also nihilism, which is there is no definite transcendent grounding, does not mean critically, and this is Gödel's point and it applies, just because we can't know if there's a transcendent doesn't mean there isn't a transcendent, quote unquote, and it doesn't mean you can't organize yourself toward it. So weird in Kurt Gödel, he thought his theory of incompleteness proved Platonism, but cheap Platonism, not like Vervaeke talks about, but he thought it proved that numbers were Platonic, right? It didn't lead to nihilism, it led to actually a higher transcendence where numbers were Platonic, because hey, if numbers cannot justify themselves and yet they still work so well, well, then they must be transcendent, right? So it's very important not to take nihilism, because then obviously the Shanti Japanese Kyoto school, their notion of nothingness is more apathetic, Master Eckhart, sort of a pregnant nothingness, right? And so it goes with incompleteness with the IN in parentheses, so it goes with unveiling with the UN in parentheses, right? Which to me goes back, I like to use those kind of terms because it's Alfred Korbowski with the Roman numerals. Like if we say we need veiling, if we use the sentence we need veiling and unveiling, well, then it sounds procedural and dialectical. No, it needs to be together in the same experience, right? You need the unveiling with the UN. That's more on the side of Hegel's reason than understanding, almost. You're now moving into the speculation. You're not just stuck in dialectical thinking, right? Good art moves beyond the dialectic, not by ignoring it, but by sublating it. You could say art that stays in the dialectic might be at risk of melodrama. It's just good or bad and it just goes back and forth. But good art actually uses the dialectic into the sublation of the unveiling with the UN in parentheses, right? And if good art, dare I say, or great art does that, well, then great political thinking, great social thinking, great philosophy will need to do the same thing. And I think, please, Tom.
No, just jumping in because will is not a thing like a fixed thing. It's a resonance field, and I think that's one of the points. Because like as soon, I'm coming to your point. As soon as we're like within the subject-object difference. We think of every obstacle as opposing the will, right? So, but in reality, it's more like, the obstacle is actually part of the will and the openness to develop in a certain direction, to unfold. And so the whole thing is more like a resonance field than a fixed thing. It's like, okay, so you can have, the kind of modern Prussian version of will, where it's like, this is my thing, and I will do exactly what I need to do. And then it's only a question of strength, how strong is my will to overcome the obstacle. But the kind of thing that I'm proposing is like, okay, let's integrate obstacle as a necessary part, because what actually happens as soon as you create a mental image of your goal in your mind, the universe will open itself up and will create a certain obstacle that you have to overcome into. So it's literally, you're talking with the universe in that moment, and it's integral part of it. And so that is the and behind the obstacle is kind of the undefined space that you can learn to inhabit.
I think that's beautiful because for me, like, not to interrupt, I'm sorry, is that when you start to see like when I was talking about limits at the beginning, it's the idea that things are unknown, you could say, but they're not unknowable. There's a critical difference between great art is unknown but not unknowable. You are
Right.
limited from knowing it completely, but that's actually great. Because if you could know it completely, it would be complete and therefore dead to you, and it would no longer actually create this attractor and training of desire into drive. And the distinction between desire and drive, to use that very generally, desire is of an object, but of course, desire is always set up for its failure because once you get the object, the desire dies. Drive is when you integrate with the fact that no object will ever fulfill you, but it's actually the process of the lack itself unveiling itself that you seek, right? And so there's this critical move in Lacan, and I'll talk about intrinsic motivation, but you can just word it this way, where you move from desire to drive, right? Art teaches you to move to drive. Art teaches you good art, and that's, you could say, the difference between a product and art is product is in the desire, which is the subject-object divide, and so desire always fails, and eventually you just hate desire, you disown desire, you disown eros, but then you just fall into nothingness, you're in, bad nothingness. Whereas when you say, no, I'm going to learn to move into drive, well, drive is by definition process. But here's the key. Here's the key. This is why lack is not a bad thing or incompleteness, because lack, the only way you can imagine a reality of, well, autopoiesis, drive, intrinsic motivation, must by definition be incomplete, with the I in parentheses. If it was not incomplete, it would be fated for eventually the failure of desire, right? Like if the system was complete, actually, then it would only be a
So,
matter of time before desire ran out and entropy wins, per se, right? And this is also the irony, actually, of theorizing a complete model or trying to theorize another theory of consciousness that finally solves it, or another theory of, art. Like the irony with that is if the theory actually succeeded, we would stop caring about the subject that the theory is about. And
right.
so, it's a suicidal mission. Coherence is the term I use is self-effacement. It's a self-effacing process, right? Lack is why we don't actually necessarily have to self-efface. We might, because we don't maintain the three parts of the soul, thymos, logos, and eros, but not necessarily. But that requires the unveiling, right? Now, to that, it's why I guess I also would just note with that, it's why, and I think all of this suggests resonance. I think resonance is a beautiful word for it. That's exactly right, because it's like in nesting your resonance and flow you're resonating. There's a resonance that you're actually, drive is a feeling of resonance. Desire is a feeling of subject opposite. Drive is resonance. You resonate with, right? It's more, it has, Seth will talk about the musicality of being. There's more of a music to it, right? I think the critical thing with this is that when you move into drive, that is when you get great art, great culture. And like the West, you could argue that the West, and certainly Dietrich McCloskey will make this point, because on this idea of the West being the best, the question she asks is, we do know that something happened called the Great Enrichment. And what the Great Enrichment is where you could say between the 1600s and the 1800s, that the average person on planet Earth went from less than $1 a day to like, they skyrocketed thousands of percent in wealth for people, right? And this is an objective fact. This is not arguable. There was something called the Great Enrichment where starting in about the 16th century, the average quality of life on Earth for everyone, not just the West, for everyone, started to go like this. It skyrocketed, right? And she goes through the arguments. It's a very powerful book. And she says, well, it started in frickin' the Dutch Empire, because in the Dutch Empire, they had two ideas, and then the printing press, and that's where getting to William Ong, I think, is important, is that he basically points out that the two ideas was that a gentleman used to be someone who didn't work because work didn't have dignity. There came to be the idea that people should work has dignity. There's dignity in work. It is not a bad thing. And then the idea was, and people should be free to do what they want to do. And then the Dutch Empire created legal structures like the LLC to help people be risk takers. And it turns out when you do that, people start inventing like crazy. We already mentioned this. And here's the trick. Wealth is more of an invention, a result of invention, not just making money, right? It's invention. And so inventions are air conditioning, lights, walls, drywall, nails. These are inventions, right? And that started in the West. That started in the Dutch Empire, right? And you can read, like Matthew Stanley has a wonderful book on the history of Japan and the rejection of colonies. They didn't want Westerners coming in. They were afraid of the Christian ministries, and they kicked them out. And there was a policy of isolationism that took over Japan, right? And you can obviously even go further back to the Persian Empire, the Silk Roads, and how basically, well, let's put it this way to be more critical, to be more precise. Wealth is a result of roads, of interaction, right? And what happened with the Dutch Empire is there was a philosophical shift that allowed ships going across the ocean, trade, and interaction, right? So you could say the West ended up creating all this wealth because they accepted interaction. They accepted running into one another and otherness. And of course, that could lead to religious wars and different things. But there was an idea that, we actually should interact with other societies. We should go explore, and individuals should be free to do what they want. You put all those things together, you get something great. But then, of course, there's the flip side. Those conditions create a society of drive, right? Ultimately, that's where you can get drive versus desire. Precisely because drive is so outstanding, drive can also give you the atom bomb. Drive can also give you really bad things, right? And that's, a way I do like the idea of, Lucifer in Christianity as the highest angel. It is the highest of beings that, if misordered, become the worst of things, right? And so you could argue, and Francis Fukuyama basically makes this argument. He says neoliberalism, if you just grant me that language, modern capitalism, whatever, he says, neoliberalism decided drive was too risky. After the World Wars, after World War II, after modernism, the atom bomb, we just decided drive was too risky. So let's just bring it back to desire and never go back to drive. Now, of course, every national strategy has pluses and minuses. I'll never forget, some of my friends out of the Middle East, they pointed out, back in like the 9/11 stuff, they were like, people in America will talk about all the violence of Islam, but you imagine what it was like to be in the Middle East and watch the atom bombs go off, right? Like, oh, they invented that. Oh my gosh. Oh, and imagine being in the Middle East when the Cuban Missile Crisis is going on. You mean to tell me that we could all be killed because of those two nations, America and Russia? It is now possible for one human being or two human beings to decide the fate of everyone? Imagine if you're in Africa or you're in the Middle East, right? That seems insanely unjust, right? All of that is possible because of drive, right? So this is why, to me, but here's the problem. If you don't have drive, people die. Like the soul dies. Human beings don't flourish. You don't get great art. You don't get great works. So the answer is not what we've done. This is my opinion. We decided to give up on drive, basically, after World War II and after the Cold War. After the Cold War, there was like, drive is too risky. Let's keep it in the desire register. And basically that worked, you could say, till 2008, or it worked for 30 or so years. And then the meaning crisis, the collapse of social capital, the political conflicts, but we need to identify that as a byproduct of the quote unquote byproduct of the choice to give up on drive, to not do drive because it's too risky, it's too dangerous. I think we need drive. Like, I think that's what we need, but we need, this is why I appreciate your book, but we need to think the will differently. Because you could say one of the reasons drive ended up perverted like this is because it did not have the proper way to think of itself. It didn't have the proper mental tools. It thought of itself egoically, and it thought of itself in terms of fear. It didn't think of its terms creatively. It also became at the mercy of logos and rationality at the expense of the social imagination, what Charles Taylor will say. And that doesn't mean we give up on drive. That means we need to rethink it. But we're only going to be able to do that with new tools. And so we'll keep you up till midnight. But I'd be curious any of those. I will be curious of any of those thoughts on anything like that. And I guess we shouldn't give up on drive. We should learn to think drive in terms of resonance and with resonance. Like that, to me, if I were to think the languages together, that's our challenge today. That's the political moment in material conditions. But anyway, I'll throw it to you for any thoughts at all.
No, my thoughts are, that I think we have a very limited historical view because we are bound to our own experiences in a kind of sense. But if I would take a guess, is that we are in the midst of a complete, vibe shift or metaphysical shift or whatever you want to call it, and that topics like will and drive and all these things will come back with a vengeance and will because there's always a periodicity to these things, and you can suppress it for a while, or you're afraid for it, but it will come back because it's a human agency. It's a very integral part, thymus and desire and will of the human experience, and sure, there's a reason why we didn't want to explore these ideas after World War II and the horrors of the 20th century, which is kind of weird because, I mean, if you think about it, it was like the age of modernism and humanism and secularism, and it was so violent. It's like it shouldn't have happened, but it did. So and then we shied away from it. But I think there's a way of approaching will, because we have learned so much. I mean, I was having this discussion with a friend. It's like all these developments in philosophy that were like a direct reaction to World War II. That you take the Frankfurt School, you take like systems theory, you take like all of these kinds of things that were like, Herbert Marcuse and, repressive tolerance and all of these kind of things that permeate and, the universities today. It's like these are direct responses to the world, to the Second World War, and so we learned so much, and I think we can approach will in a kind of way that liberates us from the historical baggage, and I think the most significant question is like, if all of this is true, what we were talking about autopoiesis and the desire machine and the will machine and cultural influences and historical conditions and geographical conditions, like who actually is it that wants? Mm-hmm. Is it you? Are you responsible for your will? Or are you not? It's like, is it me as an individual that can will my will, or is it like, or do I have to open myself up to all the conditions that might be metaphysical, like the diamond, or genetic, like nesting instincts we're talking about, or sociological instincts? It's like, do we have to take into account all these different factors that make us, and so it's like, who then is responsible, and are we really the authors of our own will? And I think I end the book with the questions like, maybe not, maybe we are not the sole authors of our will, but maybe will is a world state that kind of emerges because all of these kinds of different factors come together and open itself up for possibility and for, approaching the unknown. It's like we are in the end like complex systems. We're not static systems. If you use complexity theory, we are systems that are always looking for the edge of chaos, for the something new. Right, and so maybe the system looks for us to do something, to renew itself in a kind of way. But then we're not then we can give ourselves over to the very process, and then it's not egoic anymore. Then it's something else, and then we can then we can, I don't know. It's like it's just a feeling, It's just this feeling that we can give ourselves over to the process, and then that would make the things way more easy if we can allow ourselves to will again.
Yeah. I think that's magnificent. Well, that beautiful line at the end. The self instead is at best a sum of processes that we observe as a unit, and processes are then nothing more than acts of observing and wanting to anchor oneself as a subject in and with the world. And I think that begs the question of like, where is will located? What are we doing, right? And I think also, it it's like that idea too, where you mentioned at the end on postmodernism and constructionism and different things. The problem with that is you can kind of say, well, we can construct ourselves, right? Like just own it to the individual and make us what we want to be. But really, the construction is located in the social, right? Not the state, not the
Right.
individual. It's located in the social. And so constructivism is true in one sense, but in another way, it depends on how you frame that. Do you frame it in the ego? Is the ego trying to take it back from the social or not? It really depends. What you were saying there makes me think of when religions are at their best. Religions are at their best when they're kind of making you realize that your will is not the only will, that you're part of something that you can't reduce to your own ego. Religions
Right.
became very problematic. It's actually what David Hume warned. He talks about good religion basically and bad religion. Bad religion is based on philosophical premises. It's like, what are the right beliefs? What are the dogmas? What do I need to believe to be saved? What are the right ideas, right? Good religion is basically a reminder that there is a social force that you need to well acknowledge as impacting your will, that you can will to participate in and acknowledge. There's a humbling, but also it's very odd. There's a humbling, but an enabling in that humility. And that's critical because if you have the idea of providence, God's will, there's two things going on. One, you go, wow, God's will is control, not mine. Okay, my ego dies. But wait, there's this thing supporting me too, actually. There's this something that allows there to be space to go into new possibilities that otherwise I wouldn't have done. I mean, look at all of the exploration that was in the name of a religion, right? Because, God's calling you out, he's compelling you, and he's also got providence, right? So I think what has happened is we've lost sight a lot of what you're describing on the question of will, because often we unfortunately think of traditions of thought, say in religion, for example, primarily in terms of what they were in our minds after the object subject split and the emphasis of the logos at the expense of everything else, with the emphasis on self-determining reason, mind on a stick, all of that, right? And then it's like, oh, religions are different beliefs, and by beliefs we mean ideas, versus a reminder of forces beyond your ego that are in operation, right? And there's a necessity of that theological insight being brought into philosophy and more generally, such as what you're doing. And I think it's been extremely consequential that we've lost that. And I think also too with that, it's a kind of return, but not a repetition. It's because you were talking about the pre-egoic, pre-ego. There's some sort of pre-rational thought that is not leaving rational behind, but a certain state. And it makes me think of with the subject-object divide. There's that fascinating thinker, William Ong, and Dr. Anton talks about him with Guy Senstock. But what William Ong points out is that before the book, there really wasn't a split between the inner and outer worlds. Like if you felt anger, you spoke angrily. There wasn't the inner space where you could feel anger and internalize it, right? So the book actually created the divide between the inner and outer world, where what you felt wasn't necessarily what you split. Well, the book also, that is what makes possible technology. That is what makes possible higher forms of creativity, higher forms of technology. William Ong points out that basically the scientific treatise did not exist until after the book because you couldn't because the brain had to be focused on memory. It had to remember everything. Nothing was written down. But when you could write things down and push them away, as Dr. Lungcar talks about, you had a more flexible mind, right? And so you could think creatively, you could think imaginatively, you could think scientifically, so on and so forth. Well, that also gave us the subject-object split. So the very thing that made us more creative and gave us the great enrichment also is what created the subject-object split that has led to all of the problems. So being the best in that way brings with it the risk of being the worst at this mistake, right? So the bestness that comes from the subject-object split is also what makes possible the worstness that is a result of the subject-object split. But does that mean we need to give up the gains or the subject-object split? No, it's a quote-unquote sublation. Hume talks about returning to common life, meaning re-embedding in the original act of observation or the actual, and the return is in parentheses. Hegel talks about how every return is not a return. We need a return to drive. with the RE in parentheses, that doesn't
Right.
alienate or demonize desire, but brings it into social resonance and thinks those things. And that would be a kind of sublation of the subject object, because really, and this is where for me, again, and then I'll give it to you for any closing thoughts, because I will keep you till me. I've really enjoyed this, and I do have a work obligation that I should go to.
No, 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 no.
But in a little bit, so there's no hurry. But this is magnificent. I really appreciate it. But it's William Ong and all of those cats, Marshall McLuhan. Uh, I could go on, Kipski, all those people. There's an idea that subjectivity is and Alexander Bard, he'll talk about this, is that there is a shift in the information technology, right? Like the way, like the book, the written word, and so on, changes our experience of subjectivity. And one of the reasons I am hopeful is because I do think, and I've mentioned it before, we've had the oral tradition. We've had the written tradition. There is something here with, I almost want to call the Zoom tradition or the social coordination tradition, where what we're doing now, talking like we are, which is recorded, but you can forget you're recorded, which is getting you the benefits of flexible consciousness, but it is also bringing it back to an oral tradition. I do think there are now medium technologies, new medium conditions that can actually train the subject into more of the resonance that you are describing. Because also when I listen to, and this is where it's important to be like, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, these things are all, dopamine addiction machines. Well, yeah, they can be, but they also can enable the medium condition, I like to talk about, versus the material condition, to play on Marx, because I really do think it's the medium condition that's the big one here. The medium condition is now created something that can actually train us and model to us and create content where other people can see a modeling of a kind of interaction that is in the realm of resonance, not just reifying subject-object. Because, Vervaeke, Guy, they talk about dialogos, DC, simply this idea in a conversation, you forget yourself, you're going, ideas come that you never have before. That is a kind of information model, in my opinion, of the will, of the way, of the proper will, of the autopoiesis, right? We now have ways of interaction that modeling it. And again, it may sound, there's one degree where it can sound like, oh, you're making too big of a deal of a form of conversation. But I always like, how much of society, and we were speaking to Michelle about this, how much of society is nothing more than spaces for people to converse in? Restaurants, going to space, like a very large amount of society is nothing more than communication. How much is relationship? Like if you never have conversation with your friends, they may not be around, or your wife or your spouse or different things. Like the mode of conversation is really arguably, and this, now we're thinking Habermas, now we're thinking Tocqueville, this is really the kind of pivotal habit-making thing. And I guess I emphasize habit because we were talking before, like you can't solve the world, in my opinion. You can't change things with new theories, because the moment to change, you need to learn the theory to change. It is always going to be a minority, because only a minority of people are going to read the book, understand the new theory of consciousness or theory of how people need to be, to then put it into practice, right? So it's always going to be limited. That doesn't mean it won't help those limited people. But if you want to start taking the problem of scale, which for me is the problem, you have to be talking about new habits. You have to be talking about new models, and you have to be talking about new medium conditions, right? Because if you're talking theory, again, that could help people. It's not a bad thing, but it's probably going to be serving college grads, people who like that kind of thing, and so on and so forth. But what you need is to take something that people are already doing, talking, communicating, and show models that also are not just intellectual, but feel intimate and resonance, and then introduce that to people as a kind of experience, like the artists introduce a new experience that people do that then can change behaviors, but not in a tyrannical way, but in an attractive way. They are attracted to what they've seen. They see a new possibility. And that's when people, without even realizing they're changing their relationship to the will, are changing their relationship to the will. Like one of the reasons I like your book is because your book is a thing that can be brought into the realm of habit making, and if you can bring it into the realm of habit making, then it is scalable. And it's because autopoiesis then, which is already occurring, by the new habit structure brought about by the new medium condition, can orient and condition the ego toward that autopoiesis so it is more toward resonance versus bad cancer, I want to say. But that, of course, is only possible because there are the risks of cancer and the risks of bad drive. But this is how we can address those risks without trying to get rid of the risks, which is arguably the mistake of Francis Fukuyama's, well, that he's aware of with getting rid of thymos and all of these different things. So it just gives me hope that you see these online groups like Parallax, like Philosophy, Port of Voice, et cetera, theory, because these are all examples of modeling, not just explaining, modeling a mode of subject interaction that forgets the subject-object divide and that starts restoring the social in terms of resonance. So it gives me hope, but I will give to you on any thoughts on anything. The book is wonderful, and I don't know where the time goes.
Thank you, Daniel. I mean, there's so much to still go into. I mean, the idea is just, it's like as soon, and I think we started the conversation out with it, as soon as you use the word will in a common sense kind of way, you either by cultural osmosis or mimification or whatever, you use the concepts that Fichte, Hegel, and Schopenhauer came up with. Involuntary, it's in there. You can't talk about will without unconsciously referencing and reproducing the memes, the mimetic core of the things that they produced. And so, of course, you can create change in the society by creating grand schemes or models or integral theories or whatever, or you go a different route and you look into the concept itself in a kind of way and try to change, because like for us it's kind of normal when we talked about love, and there are different shades of love and understanding of love. There's there's the agape, high forms of love, and then there's desire. There's like, what kind of love are you talking about? And so the idea that I had is like, okay, so what did these people, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Fichte, actually do, and how can I reproduce that? Like, let's talk about what kind of will are we talking about? Let's shift the conversation here, and then it's like. For example, like one meme that I'm trying to bring all of this together, what you said, because that was quite a lot. So what's his name? Sloterdijk, he talked about anthropotechniques. So for him, it's not really interesting, a religion per se or, internet per se. It's what it does to consciousness. Yeah. That's a very interesting thought, because what we're learning through religion, through technology, through internet is ways to deal with our own psyche and consciousness. But it's that way. And the book is called the Phenomenology of Will. So it looks at will from an anthropotechnic viewpoint, if you get my meaning.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how can we use different shades and meanings of will to kind of navigate our world? It's not as if I would have, I could have written like a handbook, like a technical handbook about will, but that was not the idea. It's like, it's explicitly about the phenomenology. It's like very subjective, but kind of tries to find its way through it, so it's like, what kind of meaning do we attribute to will? And are there justifications to do it that way? Right. And so maybe I'm wrong, and maybe you could do it. I mean, there's certainly thousands other ways you could do it, but at least I think I made a good argument for differentiating three forms of will that are all valid in their kind of way, but I help us to navigate, the autopoiesis and the anthropotechniques of all things. So I think that's my way of framing all these aspects that you're mentioning.
Well, I think the book, phenomenology is not simply asking the questions of what do I experience, but if I experience X, what must the conditions of possibility be so I have X experience versus Y experience, right? Where you're trying to get what are the underlying conditions. And, as I've talked with Cadell about, if I were to make a distinction between the absolute, referencing absolute knowing in Hegel, and the truth, the truth is what Wittgenstein said, that is everything that is the case. The absolute is everything that is the case, plus you, that is changing what is the case, which is changing you, and on, and you get that encounter, right? And so there's a way, like, where objects are for you, in a sense, not divisions, like, Hegel's idea that the noumenon is in the phenomenon so that you ask questions about the phenomenon. Like, it's not to
Right.
be. So
Right.
you say, if I am experiencing these sticky notes everywhere because I've had such fun, are orange, what must the conditions of reality be so that I have the experience of orange, right? And you're going
Right.
down. So likewise, that's why it's so important to bring it back to the experience. And what is it like to will? What are you undergoing? Because if it is like this, that likeness, even if that likeness is not the whole, the very existence of the likeness must have something to do with the whole because it's like that and not this, right? Now, you can never have certainty about it, but that's precisely why it is incomplete and thus a source of
Right.
autopoiesis, right? And that's also obviously alluding to things like the analogy of being and Aquinas and what they meant by analogy, that knowing, and this is, well, honestly, to your case, if we take seriously surface and essence by Sander and Hofstadter, well, all language is analogous. There is no definition. There is only analogous. They describe like a halo. Everything, like the word cat is a halo, not a definition. Then
Right.
all intelligibility is actually analogy. It is getting at a likeness, but not a thing. That's really
Right.
important because even intelligibility itself has traces of incompleteness with the I and in parentheses. That is like what will is. It is this unfolding, never finished process that in its never finishedness is why it can be autopoiesis. And
Right.
of course, have
Right.
the
Yes.
possibility of the autocratic. So the funny thing is Logos doesn't even understand itself properly. That's the problem. Logos understands intelligibility as a complete process. But if you actually look at words like Hofstadter does, if you actually look at these things, it isn't. It actually is. It is incomplete. It is an approximation that is always redoing the approximation, right?
Right.
And that's where the tradition of analogy of being, where being is an analogous understanding, not a complete understanding, is so important. And so ego is analogous. All it can be is an analogy, a likeness. Because it can be a likeness, it can be intelligible, but it can never be the totality. But that's precisely the blessing. That's the possibility of the autopoiesis. And I mean, what you're describing too, I think about Heidegger's clearing. I think about Thomas Wynne talking about letting. I think about Bergson's time space. Bard will talk about, and Bergson's with Stephen Robinson, because all of that is being described on the idea of the will not being egotistical, but more an openness to a flowing of a process, of keeping a process going. If reality is more fundamentally time than it is space, this all makes sense because time is going to bring things to you. Time is going to unfold to you.
Well,
There's going
yes.
to be a
Yeah. Yeah.
depth, right? And so, Heidegger toward the end, um, and I do like Heidegger. Some people don't like the later Heidegger, but I think the later Heidegger, even as he goes into poetry, because I think he's trying to get a more analogous language because he starts to glimpse the problem of being in terms to the problem of the ego. That's why he's trying to do Dasein to get through Dasein, right? He's trying to get to pure being, you could say, but then that leads to various problems. Well, he comes to a kind of logic of clearing, right? Which is, how do I create a certain clearing where things can come forth as themselves and a kind of letting of things, right? He calls it being, but it associates with this kind of, there's an idea that being is alive, right? It is a thing. It almost is. Marion critiques Heidegger with being and starts talking about saturated phenomenon, this fully saturated phenomenon that kind of comes forth. But the idea is that if you just let things come forth, right? Now, you have to condition yourself in a way so things can come forth, and you have to have thymos and ergos. This is not passivity. Letting, in this sense, is not passiveness. Clearing is not passiveness. It's really freaking hard to clear. But it is a different kind of idea because you're putting the emphasis on time, right? You're letting the time bring things forth. And then you could even get more crazy and start talking about the holographic universe of Bergson, where every point, as Dr. Robinson talks about, like if every point of reality contains every other point of reality, then any point of reality that you can let and find yourself in versus egotistically eclipse has the potential of bringing forth any creative possibility in it, right? Because every moment contains every other moment. So, Tom, please.
No, it's interesting because what comes to mind is, of course, novelty.
Yes.
So like that's the best proof of will that something comes into life that was not there before. Barth calls it the event. It's something new that appears, and I always use this example because everybody said, yeah, but I wanted this to happen. Yeah, but I wanted. Yeah, but you didn't. If it didn't happen, then there wasn't really, the new thing emerging. So the new event, the novelty, is the proof that you can use or observe as a justification for the will, basically. And that's kind of important, that we have a mechanism by which we ourselves can observe if we were willing or not.
Oh,
Because
100%.
it's the novelty. Only when the novelty appears, only if we open ourselves up to the process and the new thing came, then we were actually willing. And this is like a kind of different way to think about this.
I mean, everything you're saying is, well, to me, this is why the emphasis, for me in philosophy should be on the moment of surprise, the moment of encounter, the moment of novelty, the breaks or you could even say the face of the other, the man on the side of the road, as Illich says, the errors where something goes wrong, right? That's where
Right.
philosophy finds itself, is in the glimmers. One of the books, The Philosophy of Glimmers. Like, philosophy tends to be interested in being and nothing. It finds itself in the glimmers, the surprise, the
Right.
moment. Because here's the thing: if novelty is possible at any moment of reality, then it is always a possibility in every moment of reality. It doesn't
Right.
have to happen constantly to always be potentially present, right? As a quality of
Right.
every phenomenon, right? So if once in reality you have the experience of true novelty or emergence or so on and so forth, a gentleman at the Halcyon Guild was noting, imagine you were walking down the street and for just 1 second you saw the ones and zeros out of the matrix and then they vanished. They would always be at play, even if you saw them just for 1 minute. That 1 second would redefine the whole of every moment in your life, right? And so it goes with, philosophy is not focused on the moments. It hasn't focused on the glimmers, these moments that occur that are improvisation, that are glimmer and novelty. And what you're saying too, to close, because I should do my papers before they're due, but it's just been delightful. Like philosophy, when you focus on the novel, the break, the surprise, all of this also makes sense if time is primary in this thing. Like, another way to look at it is you have silence, you have music, and then you have like reading music, and then you have improvisation, right? Like, really good improvisation requires being really good at of reading, like knowing music. You can't do good improvisation if you're not good at music, right? Although it then looks random. It looks like it's nothing, right? But improvisation is actually a heightened excellence that is simultaneously
Right.
open to the surprise, right? Like, you
Right.
can't be good at improvisation if when somebody hits a bad note, you can't instantly incorporate it. I think of Miles
Right.
Davis with that, he's able to bring the trumpet no matter what, he's able to go, right? And so he can just switch to B, just like that. And so all of this, though, again, as a mode of improvisation, which is, I think, the proper way to kind of align oneself with thinking the will, with something more like improvisation, which is musical in this way, where it seems like it's random, but it's actually not. It's in response to what's occurring on the other notes. Like, a good improvisation is listening to
Right.
everything and
Yes.
responding to it, which in a way limits their will. But actually, in that limitation, it turns out that that is the condition that makes the higher music possible, right?
Yes.
So the challenge creates the higher, per se. All of this, though, would be, look, if reality is time, primarily time space in the Bergson sense, in the White, I think Whitehead as well. If reality is like that, and then you also have the freak theory that Ebert talks about, where eventually things saturate into emergence. So the autopoiesis, which makes sense in time space, always is the process that if you keep going there is the autocatalytic possibility or the emergent possibility. Well, then, yeah, we should give ourselves over to maintaining the autopoiesis, because whatever we could think up as a good idea is always not nearly as good as the improvisation that happens on its own, right?
Right.
The
Right.
improvisation you don't plan, because we ran an art gallery for a long time, like we do the piano. The improvisation you don't plan is always way better than the one you intended, right? And
Right.
it's always way more fun. And then I remember we went till 4 in the morning with Coleman and Bernard and different people, and the police was great. But the saturation, like it's the time space with the autopoiesis, with the autocatalytic, the saturation that gives a new possibility. If reality is actually like this, which there's really good reason to think it is, because I think we could also bring it to fundamental non-locality with Stuart Kaufman, and then I'll give it to you for final thoughts. I've really enjoyed this. Then everything you're saying about the will is alignment with actuality. Then it is alignment with actuality. We actually have a conception of the will that assumes, in my opinion, a very outdated metaphysics. And we're wondering why it is leaving us adrift, because it is not actual. It is not what is actually the case. And as a result, then we disavow our mistake. We say, well, will must be bad then. It must be Will's fault. My view of reality is right. It must be Will's fault. Will must be bad. And then we end up with the condition of things that we may have. But let me give it to you, Tom, for final thought. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a treat.
No, Daniel, I enjoyed. Thank you so much for doing this. You're a fantastic host. Really, that was. I mean, we did this for 3 hours. It was amazing. Really, that's kudos to you to keep that going and to do this that way. Fantastic. Thank you.
I've enjoyed it. It's been a treat, Tom. Tell people where to get the book.
Right. Yeah. No, you get it on the website parallaxmedia.com or Amazon, or it's like the usual places. So yeah.
Outstanding. Well, Tom, I don't know where the time went. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the book.
Thank you for taking the time.
It's been my treat, sir. So all the best to you, sir. Thank you for your time, and we will do it again. Thank you.